Well, hello everybody, and welcome back to the Drydock episode 343. It's the second half of the Drydock. We've still got plenty of questions to get on with, so we're just going to get straight on with them. Michael Imbezi asks, in the most recent Admiral Spruance video, you mentioned that many members of his staff thought that the plans for an occupation, just in case Japan suddenly surrendered, were wildly optimistic until August, when Spruance briefed them on what the atom bomb was. Are there any records of this briefing or their reactions to it? And how much earlier had Spruance himself been informed about the bomb? Now, bearing in mind, obviously, I haven't researched deeply into the specific history of the Manhattan Project, so if there are those out there who have, obviously they may know some more specific details. However, based on how Admiral Spruance seemed to be planning things and what his reaction to everything seemed to be, my conjecture is that he probably knew of the atomic bomb in principle, i.e. some kind of special, especially destructive weapon that was being developed for some time, but in specific detail in terms of how destructive it was and that it was operational. I don't think he actually knew about it for very long because, well, for one thing, you have the Trinity tests and they only show that the atomic bomb actually properly works in July 1945. And the reason I say this is that, well, we know Admiral King was briefed on the atomic bomb project, the Manhattan Project, as early as 1943. So in the time between then and mid-1945, bearing in mind he's instructing Nimitz and Spruance and so forth in how to conduct operations against Japan, I find it difficult to believe he wouldn't have informed them at some point that, there's this special weapon which we might want to take into consideration for use against Japan. However, even as late as June 1945, Spruance is still very much against the idea of invading Japan, and he's looking for other options. And if at that point in his career he knew about the atomic bomb and some of the proposed uses of it, including carpet nuking Japanese defences, he may have been less opposed to the idea, because obviously they wouldn't know about the risks of fallout and everything, so the idea of just evaporating Japanese defenders and allowing a fairly easy landing for a quick and easy end to the war would appeal to someone like Spruance. But almost immediately after the Potsdam Declaration, you get this shift in planning from how to invade Japan to how to occupy Japan, just in case it mysteriously happens to collapse. And I kind of think that's probably when he's told, actually, this thing exists and could potentially knock Japan out of the war very quickly, because there's no reason for Nimitz and Spruance to have their staffs suddenly switch from invasion to occupation planning unless they know there's a relatively decent chance they're going to be utilising that plan at some point soon. In terms of the records of the staff's reaction, I believe there is one. Exactly where, I'm not entirely sure, but I'll read you an excerpt from one of the biographies on Spruance, which says, one day in early August, Spruance assembled his staff in his office and read them a top-secret dispatch. Within a few days, the United States would drop an atomic bomb on Japan. Barber, that's one of his staff members, for one, could not visualize the bomb, but Spruance seemed to know about it. So, to me, that indicates that there is some kind of record of what went on during that briefing, and it's if you like, a third-party perspective, because it's referencing Spruance in the third person, and that the observers seemed to think that Spruance had advanced knowledge of the bomb, which is very likely. And he's also making, obviously, observations about some of the other staff perhaps not being able to fully conceptualize the bomb. The only question is at that point, because unfortunately this biography doesn't contain direct citation footnotes for this section, whether or not that's the author of the biography has interviewed someone who was at that briefing for the biography and they've provided their recollections, or whether or not there is an actual briefing document or minutes of the meeting where Spruance has discussed it. That part, I'm afraid I don't know. Jack Hirsch asks, If I was aboard USS Johnson, high up in the ship for some reason, and suddenly I saw a disturbance in the smoke and mist, and felt or saw something coming towards me, and an 18.1-inch armor-piercing shell came screaming out of the smoke and passed within about 30 inches of me, missed everything else and went on its merry way, what would happen to me? Would a ton and a half going by at supersonic speed be fatal? Would it burst eardrums or cause any other harm, or would it just give me something to write home about if I survived the subsequent sinking of the ship? Now, again, this is probably a question better suited for someone who's got a degree in aeronautics, but more generally speaking, I suspect you would probably live as long as the shell didn't hit anything on the way. Because if a battleship shell passes within, 30 inches of you, if you're within the superstructure, you're probably going to die from a whole ton of shrapnel. Whereas if you're, for some reason, out on deck or up a mast and it just happens to whiz past in midair, that's a slightly different matter. Now, although the shell weighs a huge amount, it's actually displacing a very small mass of air. The volume of even Yamato's 18.1-inch shells isn't actually going to encompass all that much air. You're probably looking at maybe only 1.5 kilos to a couple of kilos, so 3 to 4 pounds of air. Now, admittedly, that volume of air is being displaced rather quickly every time the shell advances one shell length, but where it's being displaced to is obviously all around the shell. So you getting hit by some of that displaced air means you're not even being hit by a huge amount of that air, because if you assume that there were two of you and one on either side, you're still not getting hit by all of it because you've got air going up and down as well, and obviously air being pushed in front. But the sonic boom at 30 inches is going to be pretty loud. Now, you have got aircraft moving at supersonic speeds that have flown quite close to crowds, and it's loud, but it's not done much, if any, damage to people's hearing. The flip side to that, of course, is that you are very, very, very close. So, the inverse square law that means a multi-ton aircraft can fly past you 50 feet away, let's say, with nothing more than a big bang. Well, if you're 30 inches away, that noise is going to be a lot stronger. So, assuming that the shell is still travelling at a fair old clip, I suspect you might have some short-term hearing damage from the sonic boom as it goes by, and you might feel the shockwave as it comes past, but I don't think you'd be subject to all that much more in the way of adverse effects. I mean, there are experiences all across the realm of modernish artillery of dud shells landing within a few feet of people, or sometimes people, being buried by the collapse of a trench or bunker system they're in because a shell has impacted literally right over their heads and they've woken up with the dud right next to them. So clearly, that thing's been traveling within 30 inches or so of them, and the passage of the shell hasn't given them any kind of permanent debilitating health effects. I mean, okay, yeah, the being buried under loads of mud might have done, but not the shell itself. Unfortunately, there are a lot of myths out there, like, the whole thing of, a 50 cal bullet will rip your arm off even if it misses you, just if it passes within a few inches of you. It doesn't happen, and there have been real world tests to prove that. So, yeah, the main danger from a battleship shell that just passes through you in clear air is probably just going to be the hearing effect of the sonic boom. Jim Smitty asks, in Drydock 270, you spoke of just how many plans there are needed to make a ship, including all the subsystems. This has me wondering, how do ship designers get together and decide who gets what space for all the various subsystems needed in a ship near the end of the time period the channel covers? And further, how long would it take to design a whole ship, with them needing how many people to do the designs? Well, in terms of how many people, you're looking at ideally dozens, because that's why you have entire draftsman offices to draw up these plans. You can get by with half a dozen or so for a smaller vessel, but if we're talking later in the period, so 20s, 30s, 40s, ideally you need a couple of dozen, if not more, people to draw up all the plans. Now, of course, exactly how many people you have and what priority the project is given will dictate how quickly you can draw up all the plans, but Some rough guidance can be seen from the fact that, as a rule of thumb, if we're looking at a capital ship, it's usually held that the design needs to be frozen, i.e., all of the general specs agreed and approved, about a year before the keel plate is laid, which indicates fairly logically that you need about probably 9 to 10 months to draft up all the plans, and possibly longer because there might be additional plans for stuff further up in, like the superstructure, which may still be being drafted while the hull is being constructed. But that seems to be a general rule of thumb. There are some times where the process has been significantly accelerated and all of the drawings are marked as ready and completed within about 6 months of the design being frozen. And in some cases, ship construction started even earlier, but in those cases, it's absolutely certain that what they've done essentially is started the keel and the framing construction because those plans have been made, and the rest of the plans are being fed to the shipyard as they're produced as the ship goes up. Although you have to bear in mind, in terms of the overall numbers of plans you need to build a ship, you don't necessarily need to draw up every single one of those plans from scratch. For example, the mounting points for your boilers, if the boilers are used as fairly standard in your fleet, or in the case of, as you can see here, HMS Hood, the guns. She's got 5.5-inch guns. They've been used in other ships previous to this, so that those and other standard systems may already have pre-existing drawings showing at least how that system goes together. You may then need another drawing to show how that system is supposed to sit within this particular ship, but that will be just one drawing you need to freshly prepare. All the others related to that system you will need as part of the overall cover of what the ship is and how it's constructed, but you may be able to pull some off-the-shelf copies for that. Now, in terms of how they decide who gets what space for what systems, a lot of that will come down to, again, the use of either standard systems whose dimensions are already known, or at least indications of what future systems might be like. So again, using Hood as an example, her turrets were slightly different and a bit more capable than the 15-inch 42 twin turrets that had been mounted on previous ships, but their increased weight was known, but their floor space, in terms of the volume and deck space that they're taking up, that's going to be pretty much identical to existing 15-inch 42s. So for spacing the guns out on preliminary designs, well, you can do that using pre-existing knowledge. But it depends on what stage of the design you're at, because a lot of initial designs will essentially be, okay, well, what do we want capability-wise in terms of armor, guns, propulsion, etc., and there'll be known ratios based on relatively recent designs of, roughly speaking, how much each of those is going to require. So, if someone says we want 8 15-inch guns, well, we know roughly what each 15-inch gun, turret, and barbette setup is going to weigh, so that multiply that by 4, in Hood's case, well, that gives us our approximate weight of armament. We know how much armor weighs. Once we've got the basic hull design, we can work out the area of the hull covered by armor. That gives us an armor weight. And then based on our hull shape and our weights for armor and firepower and the various other general systems, which again you can roughly ratio out, then you'd work out approximately how much propulsion you needed, how much power. And then you'd go, okay, well, if we need so many 100,000 shaft horsepower, each boiler needs this much space, therefore we need this many boilers because it produces so much power, and we need so much fuel, and all of these things would be approximately calculated, and then you'd get a preliminary design that says, well, if you want a ship that roughly does this, this is what we estimate the weights are going to be, and therefore this is the size of ship you need to fit it, based on obviously not just weight but area and volume occupied as well. And then once you've eliminated maybe a dozen preliminary designs down to maybe 2 or 3 competitors, you do a little bit more analysis, refine those weight and volume analyses down a bit, again, based on a lot of previous knowledge as well. And that would give you a somewhat more accurate idea of what's going on. But there'd be a lot of ongoing discussion about the placements of the various items between elements of the design team, because obviously, well, I don't want the main armament really far out on the bow or stern of the ship, because that's going to introduce, more hogging moments when the ship is supported in the middle and there's heavy weights at the end. I want to move it further in. Well, unfortunately, you can't, because if you want this much power, you need this many boilers and this many turbines, and they're this size, so you can't move further in for that. Oh, but what if we use a smaller type of boiler? Well, that would reduce this space, but that has these compromises. So there's a lot of ongoing discussion in those initial refinement processes. And this is why overall designing a new capital ship can take 2, 3, 4 years, possibly more. But once you've gotten past those initial stages from very basic and crude overall design for lots of variants to 2 or 3 final competitive variants to the final chosen variant, it actually means you've done through iterative processes a lot of the discussion that you mentioned about what goes where, how much space is allocated, what's realistic for the expectations of the design team, etc. Which then means once you move into the final design process, it's not so much a matter of everybody arguing about, well, I need another 16 feet for the magazines. It'll be more a case of, oh, well, if we, make this bulkhead 12 inches further forward, or we move this boiler 6 inches to the right, then we get this extra benefit, or we save this little bit of extra weight. So it's very much a fine detail process at that stage. And even then, as Ryan from Battleship New Jersey will tell you, if you've seen a number of the videos that he's done comparing various plans of New Jersey with New Jersey as she is and as she was, well, you might have a final design plan, but there's very little chance the builders are actually going to fully stick to it, which is why, as with buildings, you tend to have a final as designed plan, and then you'll have a final as built plan showing all the differences. Andrew Dederer asks, is there a hard and fast rule to separate large destroyers, say late war Allied models or some of the big French ones, from small cruisers, say really old Japanese ones or the smaller Italian World War II era ones? Tonnage doesn't seem to work, so could it be dimensions, length to beam, percentage devoted to various systems, or what? Well, I don't think there's any specific hard and fast rule that you can point to that's, I would say, categorizable. But I think there are a few separate rules that you can combine as appropriate to make a distinction. So the first thing I would say is that you have to treat things by era. So comparing, say, a Tenryu class cruiser to a Mogador or Daring class destroyer isn't really fair, because you're talking about ships that are 2.5 decades apart design-wise. And while, yes, dimensionally and in terms of number and caliber of guns, the two ships might, well, those 3 ships in those case, might seem to be within shouting distance of each other, the fact is you're comparing apples and oranges, because if you looked at, let's say, a battleship in the 1890s, you can find some battleships from that period that are only 12,000 tons displacement. Now, does that mean that because, let's say, the Miyoko class fall, roughly speaking, into that same kind of displacement range about 20 to 25 years after the design of some of those late 1890s battleships, that therefore the Miyoko class is a battleship, or that the Kaiser Friedrich III is a cruiser? Well, obviously not. So similarly, we shouldn't let ships from different times look like they match up with each other in terms of what they could be. The single largest guideline, I would say, when you're getting contemporary ships and their roles are beginning to get a little bit blurred, is what is the mission profile that the Navy is designing that ship for? If they are designing them for a combination of fleet escort and fleet attack, primarily with torpedoes, then they are almost certainly going to be destroyers. Whereas if they are perhaps designing them as fleet scouts and independent commands to go off and do various missions at long ranges and long distances, then they are going to be cruisers. If you're looking at World War II, then you can, in theory, actually make a tonnage argument, in as much as even something really monstrous like a Mogador is just on the lower side of 3,000 tons. So you could perhaps say if it's 3,000 tons or less, it's a destroyer. If it's 3,000 tons or more, it's a cruiser, which would then put something like the Italian Capitani Romanis into the cruiser category because they're 3,700 and something tons. You could also perhaps argue for armouring, i.e. if someone has put any kind of armour plate on a vessel, then that would automatically make it a cruiser, as long as that armour plating is something more substantial than splinter proofing, or is intended to be more substantial than splinter proofing. I say that mainly because you will get some destroyers, especially in the latter period of the late 30s and 1940s, which will have an inch of splinter proofing along their where most ships would have belt armor. So like a Fletcher class has that, and that's to improve survivability against splinter and blast, but it's never designed to stop anything that's actually going to hit it in earnest. Otherwise, you'd be saying a Fletcher class is a cruiser, which is not the case. So if you like, you could then use that as a trio, i.e. what is the Navy designing it to do? Is it above or below 3,000 tons? And does it carry anything that could be reasonably argued to be armor against actual projectiles instead of just anti-blast? If you tick the would therefore be classed as a cruiser box in 2 or more of those, then it's probably a cruiser. And if you tick the boxes of 2 or more of those in the destroyer category, then it's probably a destroyer. But that would be my rough rule of thumb. Dave asks, going back to the January 11th Drydock regarding an HMS Tiger 14-inch modernisation with a deleted turret, with the weight and space savings as well as the advances in machinery, would it have been possible to add torpedo bulges, a Queen Anne's mentioned superstructure, terrifying amounts of heavy or medium anti-aircraft guns, up to 5 inches of deck armour, maybe increasing the belt to 10.5 inches, and still reach 31 knots on an absolute max-out refit? Well, basing ratios off of the modernisation of the Queen Elizabeths and Renown, you're probably looking at conservatively saving about 3,000 to 3,500 tons in weight by deleting Q turret and modernising the machinery of Tiger. Now, and that's allowing for the new machinery to be put in place to maintain her speed. So that's your default 28 knot Tiger. So that means 3,500 tons, possibly more to play with. That's a fair bit of weight. And as you can see, she already had a relatively substantial superstructure. So if you were going to tear all that down, as well as probably, well, I'd say for a battle cruiser, you're probably still preserving 2 funnels rather than trunking everything into one, but you're definitely going to get rid of at least 1 funnel. That's probably going to get you easily a Queen Anne's Mansion superstructure. The top weight would potentially be a little bit of an issue, but I think the top weight stability issue specifically would be helped by removing Q turret. So yeah, Queen Anne's Mansion definitely can go in there. Deck armor, probably, the weight of protection and the overweight of her deck armor. 5 inches deck armor could be done with some of your remaining weight allowance. The belt armor, it would be a bit of an interesting one, because I'm not sure how much extra utility you'd get out of that. I mean, what can you resist with 10.5 inches of armor that you can't resist with 9? What's the margin there? And you're also looking at 31 knots for an all-out maximum speed. So you are going to have to eat into that margin somewhat for additional machinery. Now, bulges, I think you could probably do anti-torpedo bulges, because If you did want to completely update the armor, whether that, I mean, 5 inches deck armor, I think is a good one. The belt armor, I'd be tempted to actually go either a little bit more or don't do it at all, because as I said, what is the 1.5 inches getting you? My instinct, given Renown's capabilities, would actually just be to stay with the original thickness, maybe extend that more. So rather than go for distributed armor, kind of adapt her a little bit more towards an all or nothing, i.e. the belt is either 9 inches thick or it just doesn't exist. Because that in turn would allow you to put an awful lot more of your weight and displacement towards your heavy and medium anti-aircraft guns, because of course you're going to take out all of the casement battery. You could put a nice lot of 4.5-inch twins amidships, because especially without Q turret there, and you could put a really nice cluster of medium AA, obviously probably quad or noctuple pom-poms. Again, partly my favourite idea would be for a stepped design or central spine where Q turret was, to allow you for maximum sweep, with a few up front as well. Now, I have a feeling perhaps that with the bulges, which are obviously going to affect your hydrodynamics a bit, but again might be needed to compensate for the weight additions, and your desire to go to 31 knots, you might have to actually go in for a bow extension like the Italians did to the Cavours to increase your waterline length. But that's not necessarily such a bad thing, because as you can see, Tiger's original bow is rather vertical, so extending the bow and making it a bit more of a flared forward raked bow to improve seakeeping as well might help. So yeah, I think absolute max out, you probably could do everything that you want to, but I'd be tempted to keep the existing belt armor but just scaled up in coverage rather than thickness. Rob Smith asks, what technologies would not have worked if they had been invented, deployed, or developed about 150 years earlier to when they actually were historically? It's a bit of a difficult one, really, because some technology that immediately springs to mind as, well, that'll never work 150 years before it's historically deployed, is more to do with the scale of the infrastructure that backs up that technology than the technology itself. So, for example, if you were to say, oh, well, what about steel armor being deployed on ships? Well, historically, that's happening in the latter part of the 19th century, so the late 1800s. So now we're saying, oh, well, that's actually going to happen in the early 1700s. Well, theoretically, there's nothing stopping you from putting steel armor on a ship in the early 1700s. They know how to make steel. They've known how to make steel for a very, very long time. The problem is making steel at scale. That's what you need the Bessemer process for. That's your big problem. So steel armor per se isn't the problem. You probably could pay somebody to, make a really nice couple of inches, 3-4 inches thick steel plate to stick on your ship of the line. It would just cost you an absolute fortune to do. Whereas once the Bessemer process comes along, you can do it pretty easily. And a lot of other stuff also is underpinned by other scientific discoveries, like steam engines, for example. The basic steam engine was around for a very, very long time before it went into a ship. It was making it compact enough and high pressure, for a given value thereof, enough to generate useful power to be anything other than a mine clearing pump that made it useful. So you could deploy the initial steam engine technology much further back, because they had the ability to manufacture the basic iron components, big square boilers and so forth, 150 years before it was first put out. But you're then relying on the same level of scientific advancement to move over to cylindrical boilers or higher pressure boilers, better methods of construction, etc., to then get them to the point where you can fit them on ships. And then, of course, because of the size of ships, you're also looking at potentially having to upscale the coal mining industry somewhat, which ironically enough is also helped by the existence of steam pumps. So I think potentially the answer is more along the lines of, well, how much of that backup infrastructure and knowledge are we talking about coming across to the 150-year earlier mark, or are we just talking about, taking something that was developed at one time period and teleporting it and only it, like say an exploding shell gun, back 150 years and seeing whether or not they can actually replicate it? Real MCB asks, during the Second World War, which submarine would be considered the most luxurious to serve on from the perspective of both the crew and the officers? In absolute terms, probably the German Type 14s, the milk cows, because they're pretty large by World War II submarine standards. Because they're supply subs, they're not expected to directly serve in combat. Indeed, they can't for the most part. So, there's not going to be as much sneaking up on convoys and potentially being depth charged, although, of course, a lot of them would fall victim to air attack eventually. But also, because they are big supply subs, they're a little bit wider than most subs, so they're going to be a little bit more stable, a little bit nicer of a ride. And again, being supply subs, they're stocked full of all sorts of wonderful things, like lots of refrigerated goods and a small onboard bakery. So if you want to spend a substantial portion of your war cruising in relative safety, supplied with fresh bread, refrigerated supplies, and everybody loves you when you show up on your side because, hey, you're giving them a bunch of fresh bread, refrigerated supplies, the occasional torpedo and a bit of oil, then yeah, the milk cow is the place to be. The only caveat I would put on that is that the milk cow lacks one thing which may not matter too much in the North Atlantic, except in certain periods of weather, which is air conditioning. And therefore, it's also a little bit of a cheat because, of course, it's technically speaking a non-combat sub. If you want to look at submarines that actually have the means to fire torpedoes at the opponent, i.e. frontline combat subs, then you're probably looking at the Gato and Balao class, because in terms of provisions, you have a refrigeration store on board, so you're not just relying purely on canned stuff. If your crew and captain are enterprising enough, you may have a stolen ice cream machine on board as well. And about the only thing you lack provisions-wise compared to a milk cow is the bakery. And you're still a very, very substantial sub, so compared to all other subs, your accommodation levels are positively luxurious. Plus, you have aircon to help keep you cool. Now, of course, that's far more of a necessity in the Pacific than it is in the North Atlantic, but still, temperature regulation is a very fun thing. So yeah, modern US fleet boats for frontline combat units and milk cows for non-combat units, although that probably depends on how much you value aircon versus fresh food. Hark asks a series of questions about Richelieu shells, so I'm just going to cover them as they go through the answer. Are there photos or cross-sectional schematics of the shells? Yes, there are. There are a few shells still in existence. In terms of schematics, you do have to be a bit careful because some of the really detailed schematics that are out there are for the US shells that were built for Richelieu after she came in to Brooklyn Navy Yard, which of course are not the same as the ones built originally for her. So for example, this one on its side, this is from French battleships 1922 to 1956 by John Jordan and Robert Dumas. So this is a diagram of the original shell type. And you can see the cavities for the gas canisters down there in the base plug. Then, to accommodate the gas canisters, did they have a thicker bottom or a reduced explosive charge? No, it is literally just the base plug had cavities put into it. What chemical warfare agents did they use, and did they have different types to choose from? I haven't been able to find the exact information for this because pretty much all the sources just mention poison gas of some description. Given its prevalence across various powers in the 1930s, I would suspect possibly mustard gas, but phosgene was also quite popular for people to sort of either have the capacity to manufacture or have a backup stock of. Because theoretically poison gas had been outlawed in the 1920s, but everybody either had a small stockpile kept back quietly or the ability to manufacture. And as I said, I would suspect mustard gas more likely, maybe phosgene, but they don't seem to have looked at having multiple different choices. Then, did the ship carry enough gas canisters for all the shells. Well, now what seems to have occurred is they designed the shells, but at some point between designing the shells and the gun system for the Richelieus and actually deploying, they never actually put the poison gas onto the ships, which, okay, even if they had planned to, you've got to remember Richelieu hightailed it out of France in a almost complete but still non-complete state, and Jean Bart was never completed fully during the Second World War. So it appears that the two ships never actually had any poison gas canisters aboard. And did they have special storage space for the canisters? I suspect they almost certainly would have just been stored in the magazines, perhaps in special compartments or containers within the magazines, but ultimately the magazines are probably some of the most secure areas on the ship, so there's no need for a special ultra magazine at that point, especially because you'd need to obviously fit the things into the shells before sending the shells up the hoists if you are planning on actually using them. And related to that, when in the loading process did the canisters get installed in the shell? This would have happened before action, because what you need to do is unplug screwed caps in the base plug and insert the gas canisters into the base plug and then rescrew that plug. And it's that screwed plug that actually was the weak point, because that collapsed, letting propellant gases into the empty gas canister cavities, which then caused the whole base plug to collapse, which then caused the shell to prematurely detonate. So given that if you're in the process of loading shells for battle, you don't have the time to stop and go, hang on a minute, for each shell we've got to unscrew 4 little screw caps, get out very carefully, canisters of poison gas, put them in, screw everything back up and send it on its way. This would have been done in anticipation of action had they ever carried the canisters and thought they might need them. And how were the canisters designed to survive the pressure and heat of during firing? Well, the canisters obviously would have a certain amount of rigidity to them, and then that would support the screwed-on cap that would go into the base plug, thus, and obviously they'd be supported by the sides of the base plug as well. Although, obviously, with the things collapsing during firing historically, there is some question, I would think, that even with the gas canisters actually inserted, whether or not they would have been strong enough, or whether that screwed cap collapsing would still have been a problem, because obviously they weren't anticipating that would be a problem, because they designed the shell in theory to be safe firing even without the gas canisters in it, but it wasn't. So potentially a bit of a design flaw there. And why wasn't it discovered during testing that this could cause catastrophic failure? Well, you've got to bear in mind it's not a guaranteed catastrophic failure, because when Richelieu fires her guns at Dakar, and later on when Jean Bart fires her guns at Casablanca, the shells don't explode every time they're fired. They prematurely detonate a lot more often, and the gas cavities are the reason for that, which is not ideal, but the majority of the shells that are fired don't prematurely detonate. And that in turn means that if you're conducting careful pre-acceptance firing trials, there is a reasonable chance that those particular shells may not have prematurely detonated, especially when you add into the fact that at least Richelieu was using remanufactured propellant charges, which would have caused their own problems as well. And finally, what's the background of the shells, and did other navies have similar ideas? Well, yes. Even going back into World War I, people had the idea of, oh, well, why don't we fire poison gas shells at enemy ships, the same way as we're firing poison gas shells and having poison gas shells fired at us on the Western Front. That had gone away because people pointed out the problems inherent to poison gas being fired at ships, which I've covered many times before, but essentially a pure poison gas shell is just going to slightly ruin the exterior of a ship. It's not going to really affect the ship's ability to fight, at least in World War I, immediate post-World War I conditions. When you've got anti-aircraft crews out there, perhaps it's more of an issue, but even then, the ship just moving would tend to just leave the gas cloud behind. In the interwar period, then, there were considerations about, well, maybe we should use poison gas in some other way. But then in came the ban on poison gas, The French, obviously, in the 30s decided they were going to ignore that to a certain degree, or at least fit the shells for but not with, just in case the ban was revoked at some point in the future. And of course, the idea was by fitting it to the base of an armor-piercing shell, that would get the armor-piercing shell into the ship in question, and then the poison gas would be distributed inside the ship, which negated a lot of the problems with using pure poison gas shells. And that, of course, would increase the lethality of shells, which makes sense with the French, because bearing in mind the French have a relatively small fleet and would anticipate continuing to have a small fleet relative to their potential opponents going forward, so maximize the lethality. As far as I'm aware, no one else brought this kind of concept to fruition in their armor-piercing shells. It seems to be a uniquely French thing in terms of implementation. Alternate historian Turtleduck asks, a couple of years back I asked how you'd redesign the Lexington-class battlecruisers, and you redesigned them as an American Renown class with twin 16-inch guns. Now I'd like you to redesign one of your favourite ships, the Königsberg class, with the only condition being they must be designed as a surface raider or escort for vessels on surface raiding missions. So if we're redesigning the Königsberg as a pure surface raider or escort for a larger surface raider, there's a few things I'm going to do, because let's face it, we've got 6,000 tons to play with. Yeah, you could pull off something like an Arethusa. That's a little under 6,000 tons, but an Arethusa has 2/3 the armament. And, well, a lot of the problems, I mean, there's a whole laundry list of problems with the Königsbergs, but some of the problems are because they're essentially trying to fit at least 8,000 tons worth of light cruiser capability into a 6,000 ton hull. So let's not do that. I would say first acknowledge that at 6,000 tons you're not going to get 9 guns. You're going to get 6 at best. At that point, the next stage is to say, well, where are those 6 guns best located? Okay, it's a raider. It's supposed to be closing in on targets. At that point, I would say put your guns up front. Now, you might say, well, hang on a minute. Well, what if you're being chased? Then it's a good idea to have your guns at the back, but you want high speed. So ideally you should be able to outrun your opponents, and on top of that you could have other ways of discouraging them, like carrying large amounts of mines, for example, or perhaps torpedoes. And dropping the main gun slightly would also allow you to save weight in terms of both armament and armor. So roughly speaking, I would probably design something like this. So you see what I've done here is I've put my 2 triples up front, super firing. So I've abandoned the 3rd triple entirely. So yeah, I've only got 6 guns, but for charging in, that's perfectly fine. I've then concentrated my machinery amidships, and that means that my citadel, for such armor as I can put on, is actually very nice and compact. Now, unfortunately, in Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts, which is what I used to visualize the thing, not to calculate the displacements, but just to visualize it, you can't put on aircraft launching facilities, so I stuck a little barbette on that platform after the funnels to indicate that's roughly where I would put the aircraft launching facilities, at least in this design. And then you can see right off I've got mine-laying equipment and 2 quintuple centerline torpedo launchers. The other thing is that there's some kind of bug that wouldn't let me put side-mounted secondaries, but you would also have some 88mm AA guns on either side of the ship, probably just forward of the torpedo launchers and maybe abreast the funnels as well. Now, of course, you could play around with this slightly. You could, for example, maybe put the torpedo armament where the air launch facilities are, so maybe have 2 triples or 2 quadruples up there, and then have the aft section more American style devoted to handling aircraft, at which point you could probably fit a reasonable number of aircraft, which is quite useful as a scouting raiding vessel. Or there is a third option, which I would only do in the latter case. So if I was designing as a surface raider, this would be my design, because if somebody's chasing me, I've got mines and torpedoes to get them to go away. If I'm attacking merchant ships, I've got 6-inch guns, or 5.9 inches. That's really all I need. And I've got some aircraft for scouting. But if I was going to be designing a vessel purely as a surface raider escort vessel, i.e. something to accompany the Panzerschiff or the Scharnhorst, then I would actually do something completely different. Scrap the idea of 5.9-inch guns altogether and stick probably 5 twin 105mm on there. Maybe 6, but I think 5 is probably a more reasonable number to fix. I still want some torpedoes. And that gives me 10 guns that are dual purpose, anti-air and anti-surface. Now, they do lack a bit of anti-surface punch. I mean, I've still got more than enough to overwhelm destroyers and so forth, but let's face it, 10 105mm probably not going to fare very well against cruisers or even potentially some of the better armed merchant cruisers, although I do have modern fire control systems, so that'll probably give me a bit of an edge. But the point is, if I'm an escort, then I don't need to worry about that so much. I need to worry about keeping my big charge safe, and once the Panzerschiff or the Scharnhorst has dealt with the enemy convoy escorts, well, a bunch of 105s are, more than enough to put down merchant ships, and by having a relatively light main battery, especially for a 6,000-ton cruiser, that would allow me to fit huge amounts of fuel, as well as torpedoes and maybe an aircraft handling facility or two. But essentially building something a bit like a hybrid between Capitani Romani and the Design V, which was the predecessor to both the Tribals and the Didos, it's a very, very specialist role. Might have some decent use in Narvik and other operations as well, to be honest, as a giant destroyer, but that would be, as I said, very, very specialist, pure escort ship. It wouldn't be a particularly good cruiser on its own. And yes, you can point out the Atlantas carry more guns and heavier guns and on not much more displacement. But at this point, as I said, the relatively light armament plus torpedoes would be because I'm going for the ability to move at high speed and an absolutely insane amount of fuel so that my dinky little 6,000-tonner can keep up with the range requirements demanded by a Panzerschiff or a Scharnhorst. Hunter Park asks, while doing some research, I stumbled across Garsky, Doolin and Denley's analysis of the sinking of Prince of Wales. It's hosted on the website pacificrex.com, one that I do not know to be a peer-reviewed platform. Is this how these findings are typically published, or is there some annual or quarterly journal I am missing? Well, it's just lucky it's there, to be perfectly honest. No, these kinds of things are not typically published on I'm not going to say random websites. Pacific Rex is a decent website, but yeah, it's not a peer-reviewed academic website by any means. The problem that you run into is one that unfortunately a reasonably large number of papers have run into as time's gone on, which is essentially a digital black hole. Because what it used to be, years and years ago, is that if you had a conference, then all the papers for that conference would be gathered up and published in a magazine or a book form, depending on how large the conference was and how long the papers were. And some of those copies would be lodged in libraries and archives, and you could come and look them up. Great, fantastic. However, in the new digital age, not only have printing costs gone up, which makes that kind of publication somewhat more expensive, but also because people want to access things online, the demand for that publication in physical copy has gone down, which combined means that it becomes less and less of an incentive for conferences to actually do that physical publication. And if they don't physically publish it, or they don't publish it in a particularly large run, the chances of a physical copy getting lodged anywhere that's accessible is very minimal. Now, of course, the flip side to that is that with digital publication, everyone goes, yes, that's great, I will host it on the website for the conference, or the website for the organization that's organizing the conference. And in this particular case, that analysis was originally hosted by the Society of Naval Architects and Marine Engineers, because it was originally presented at the International Marine Forensics Symposium in 2012. And previously to that, it was also presented in 2007. But in any case, but in those earlier days of digital hosting, it appears to have fallen down a bit of a black hole, because it's been presented at that symposium. Therefore, the symposium papers should be stored online. So you go to the SNAME or SNAME, whatever it is, Society of Naval Architects and Marine Engineers website, and yes, they have a section for technical papers. and you can go, and it says conference and symposium papers and journal articles. They're all being moved, and the problem is now they are all being moved to this other hosting site called One Petro. So I went to One Petro and I searched and nothing came up. So I searched by author and I searched through by all three authors' names, and all three authors have presented multiple interesting papers on that site. But this particular one does not appear to have survived the transition, and it appears the original event website that was set up has long since lapsed. It's not available anymore in any way, shape, or form. And so, at least as far as I can see, the Society of Naval Architects and Marine Engineers no longer has this paper that was presented at one of their conferences on any of their archival hosting platforms. And therefore, the one on Pacific Rex is basically a lone digital survivor, much like actually that report from the Cameron documentary Dive on the Bismarck, which I've hosted on my website. You know, originally, again, would have been hosted on its own custom website. Now, good luck finding that. You have to really trawl around the web to find it, which is why I've hosted a copy, because that's pretty much the only way people are going to find it nowadays. So yes, it was originally properly published, but now it either seems to no longer have survived on its original publisher's host or their new host. And also, One Petro is a subscription or pay only thing, so it's paywalled anyway, even if it was there. It's one of the disadvantages of the modern digital age. While loads of information is very easily accessible, it's only accessible as long as someone pays the website hosting fees and somebody realizes what's there. I have occasionally toyed with the idea of just hosting my own server, as in, you know, physically buying a server rack with terabytes and terabytes and terabytes of storage and mirroring various websites, not as an online thing, but just, you know, kind of like a naval history niche themed version of the Wayback Machine, essentially just completely archiving entire critical naval history related websites and just essentially keeping them as a third party offline backup in case something should ever happen to them. But one, I don't know what, if any, copyright issues there would be concerning that. And two, while I can buy and set up a server rack with, you know, a couple of 100 terabytes of storage, the intricacies of setting up some kind of script to essentially clone entire websites with potentially quite a lot of information on them is something which I probably could learn but don't have the time to do so. So if anyone thinks that's a good idea, maybe get in contact and we can work something out between us. Chris Knight asks, the Great Lakes freighters SS Carl D. Bradley and SS Daniel J. Morrill were lost when they broke apart in winter storms, and at least some investigations placed the blame on high sulfur content in the steel used in their construction, causing it to become brittle at the temperature the ships were at. This problem with sulfur content wasn't identified until 1947. How is it that warships didn't run into problems with these steels, or did they, and it just wasn't very well publicised? Well, certainly to a degree, warships did suffer occasionally with problems with hull plates cracking when they shouldn't, but usually this would be patched up and reinforcements made, in part because of what I'm about to talk about, which is that warships tend to be much more overbuilt as compared to freighters. The vast majority of, well, honestly, the vast majority of ships are built by the lowest bidder, but particularly when you're looking at commercial vessels, especially cargo vessels, they might have safety factors built into them to try and deal with storms and so forth, but generally they are built to the absolute minimum possible safety factors that they think they can get away with, because everything else that's above that is additional weight which you have to haul around, which isn't earning you money. So essentially most commercial operators take a bit of a gamble between how much extra money can we get by ditching these couple of 1,000 tons of extra reinforcement versus the potential of losing the entire, albeit slightly cheaper ship if it runs into some really bad conditions. And obviously it's slightly cheaper to build the ship in the first place as well. And if they get that calculation correct, and you end up with a ship that, you know, is built cheaper, runs slightly cheaper because it's lighter and carries more cargo, therefore makes you more money, and just never happens to run into anything particularly nasty, well, then you win. And until you don't. Incidentally, this is one of many reasons why you'll see most cruise liners, as opposed to the one or two true ocean liners left in the world, will run like heck if a hurricane blows up. Ostensibly, they'll tell you it's all about passenger experience. It's okay, yeah, it's partly that, because you don't really want to be in a giant floating office block in the middle of a hurricane. But it's also in large part because there are some rather significant questions about whether a modern cruise liner would actually even survive a particularly nasty hurricane, cyclone, typhoon, or wherever it is you happen to be. Now, conversely, while a lot of warships are also built by the lowest bidder, the minimum requirements of a warship tend to be very different to that of a freighter. They're a lot more compartmentalized, for one thing, and generally speaking, that's compartmentalization part of it, they're designed to withstand a lot of battle damage. A freighter is normally, especially when fully loaded, not really designed to have a chunk of itself blown away. It will just break up and or sink. A warship is explicitly designed to, at least in theory, remain afloat and somewhat operational, even if several large chunks of it have been blown away with various holes put into it. And that means that even if you do have a problem with, let's say, high sulfur steel cracking in low temperatures, that crack A will be, like, if it happens at all, will be likely to be localized to a certain area of the ship, thus much more easy to patch up and or live with until you can get home to do repairs. But also it's less likely to happen in the first place, because although the steel may have become much more brittle, there's also going to be a lot more of it. So let's say, again, just using arbitrary figures, let's say that a particular hull plate on a freighter is designed with a safety factor that would allow it to withstand 100 meganewtons of force, and it encounters 80 meganewtons of force, but thanks to the high sulfur steel, it actually can, despite being designed to withstand 100 meganewtons of force, it can only withstand 60 meganewtons, so it breaks. Okay, that's bad. A warship, however, even though it's using exactly the same kind of steel, might be designed to withstand 300 meganewtons of force as part of its need to be much more heavily built. So even if you lose 40%, like our previous example, so you lose 120 meganewtons of resistance, well, you've still got 180 meganewtons. So if you encounter 80 meganewtons, well, you're still going to withstand it. So you might have, if you looked at it on a microscopic level, micro fractures and such developing, but you're much more likely just not to have the fracture occur. And on top of that, you have the other thing, which is that, again, construction of merchant vessels, especially cargo carriers, tends to be out of the cheapest, nastiest steel they think they can get away with because it's cheap. Whereas with warships, at least most of the time, some thinking goes into the composition of the steel, and they will tend to use various types of steel, because armor steel will have a different chemical composition to structural steel, and structural steel you use in the ship's frame and the ship's keel might be different to the kind of steel you use for the decks and the hull plates, for example. And then you get some special cases like the US where they make huge amounts of the ship structure out of STS steel, which is a kind of low-grade armor steel. It's kind of the very, 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 very upper end of constructional steels, and just about coming in at the low end of homogeneous armor, depending on which way you squint at it. There are a few minor differences between STS and Class B, or Ducal steel in the UK, and so on and so forth through the various other manufacturers and countries. But essentially what it means is that the really nasty steel, which is the most subject to brittle fracture in cold conditions, probably isn't being used all that much, if at all, in warships to begin with. Chief Eyeroll asks, for British cannon produced in the Age of Sail, were there foundry marking systems that indicated which foundry produced the cannon, such as differences between the royal foundries or other suppliers to the Admiralty? And how common was it for captains or their master or warrant gunners to select cannon based on preference to a specific foundry, a specific year of manufacture, or other criteria? Was there a preference or hierarchy between versions of cannons produced in different countries? I.e., did people prefer captured guns versus guns produced in the UK? So there are two periods in the Age of Sail, if specifically in regard to this, pre-1780 and post-1780. Pre-1780, you may find foundry markings on a cannon or some other easily identifiable way of saying this cannon was made by this particular set of people, but it is not necessarily the case, because some foundries would very happily and proudly put their particular mark on it. Others didn't care or wouldn't for whatever reason, but there are ways of discerning. So if you look at these two cannon, for example, you can see that there are in fact different foundry markings on these cannon, but you could also see that they're actually in very different styles. The reinforcement hoops are in different locations, and actually there's a differing number of them as well. So you can use those clues as well, because certain foundries will have certain styles of how they made their guns versus how other foundries made their guns, even though the gun itself may be just they might both be 12 pounders or 24 pounders or 32 pounders or whatever. Post 1780, however, it became mandatory to have some kind of foundry marking on the guns, ideally on the trunnions, because then it would not impact so much on the barrel. But now it was mandatory. So you might still have some kind of fancy design on the gun itself, but there would always be somewhere on the gun, and for those of you who are interested, the trunnions are the two little sticky out bits that get mounted on the carriage, that will have a foundry marking on it. So 1780, and well, guns manufactured after 1780 will have these, but of course a ship in 1790, 1800 might still be using a gun that was made pre-1780, and therefore might not have such markings on, depending, as said, on the foundry preference at that point. Now, in terms of how common was it for captains or members of their crew to select a cannon based on a preference for a specific manufacturer or year or something, not very, because most of the time, if a ship was going to be paid off and going into ordinary for a while, its guns would just be dismounted wholesale and put into a pool of guns that port would maintain, hence why you have gun wharf keys in Portsmouth, and various similar things in Chatham and so forth. And then when a ship was going to be recommissioned or put back into service, then it would be issued with guns from the general stockpile by the Navy. They would be like, okay, well, you need 32 pounders, you need 32 24 pounders, and you need 36 12 pounders. Well, there you go, have fun. That would be the standard. And if you try to say, well, actually, I would like 32 pounders from the Woolwich Arsenal, but I think I'd prefer my 24 pounders from the Karen Works or something like that, they just look at you and go, mate, you're getting what you're getting. And that's assuming you're even in a position to do that, because very often the fit out of the ship could begin, i.e., guns being put back on and so forth, before they'd actually decided on who actually was going to captain that vessel. But if you had enough influence, i.e., you were a very famous officer like Nelson or Collingwood or Duncan, or you had plenty of connections either with the dockyard in particular or perhaps higher up in things, then you might be able to go through and say, okay, well, actually, I would like these cannon. Now, it wouldn't necessarily be I think this particular foundry in this particular unit, I would like a 1785 Woolwich, please, a bit like ordering a fine wine. It would more be a case of, within reason, the guys in the cannon storage and handling facilities would have an idea of which guns were better and which ones were worse, and you might have a general idea as well as to what kinds of guns were better or worse. And therefore, either by just, asking for the return of a favour or offering a favour later on, or maybe even a little bit of money here or there, you might be able to then go, well, actually, I'd prefer it if you could give me 32 pounders from the good stockpile, if that's all right. Not the trashy, almost shot out stockpile I know you keep over there in the corner. And then you might get a better fit out of gun. And even then, even if you took a lot of care, there would still be a lot of variation within the guns that you got. So, for example, when HMS Shannon under Captain Broke is out in the War of 1812, one of the reasons they have the gun that is so accurate they can knock down multiple people on Chesapeake's deck who are trying to control the ship's wheel is because Broke has exhaustively gone through every single gun on his ship with extensive gunnery trials and worked out which one shoots fast and accurately and gone, right, that one is the one that we're going to use, even though the majority of his guns were generally pretty good anyway. Send Penguins asks, I was just skimming through the artwork of Charles Peers and came across this image of HMS Courageous in Drydock. It shows the stern of the ship during its larger light cruiser configuration and what appears to be mine-laying rails going down the quarterdeck. With many other artists, I'd question the accuracy of the image, but Peers does have a reputation. Were Courageous and presumably Glorious also configured to do fast mine laying on top of all the other weird and wonderful things Jackie Fisher expected them to do, except for withstand muzzle blast from their own main batteries? Well, the good news is that the picture is accurate, but it is accurate for a very, very specific period of time and only for this ship. So by default, Courageous and Glorious were not supposed to lay mines, as you might expect. However, in April 1917, Courageous was fitted to lay mines. Subsequent to the Second Battle of Heligoland Bight, she was unfitted to lay mines. The mines laying rails were taken away and other things were put on, like aircraft launching facilities. So given that the addition of the mine rails took place in April and the removal of them took place in kind of November, December 1917, and of course in this picture there appears to be a significant amount of snowfall everywhere, I would suggest that this picture is specifically taken of Courageous after Second Heligoland Bight, when she's in for repairs from her own muzzle blasts and also for the operations that will see the mine laying systems removed and the various other systems installed. So this is a very particular point in time in late 1917 that's being depicted and is unique only to Courageous, because as far as I can tell, Glorious never had mine laying rails fitted. Fahrender Ritter asks, Admiral Doenitz, through headquarters staff, coordinated U-boat attacks on a micro level, and U-boats communicated fairly often their position as well as any sightings of ships and convoys. There have been arguments that therefore captains didn't have as much freedom to make their own decisions, and it provided a lot more information that Ultra was able to use to crack Enigma and allowed intelligence to have a clear understanding of U-boat locations. If Doenitz did not do the coordination, would these arguments have merit? Would Allied intelligence have suffered? And what about the overall impact on the Battle of the Atlantic? Well, it's a very interesting one, because there would have been significant advantages and disadvantages to each side if Doenitz hadn't run his U-boats the way that he did. So, and obviously, an advantage for one side is almost automatically a disadvantage for the other. So let's look at it from an Allied perspective. If Doenitz doesn't micromanage his U-boats and doesn't require them to report in quite as much, then the negatives for the Allies and therefore the positives for the Germans are that, high frequency direction finding, HFDF, is going to be much less useful because they don't have as many signals to lock onto. So working out where German U-boats are from, oh look, there's one transmitting now, it's over there, via triangulation, that's not going to work out as well. Also, if they're not transmitting as much, then there's not as much information available to intercept, and even if the British managed to break the Enigma code, without as much information out there, there's less useful information for them to use in terms of redirecting convoys or preparing convoy escorts to encounter U-boats. There's also the fact that without the regular transmissions of things like weather reports, because the Germans have a relatively limited number of weather stations and weather predicting capability in the North Atlantic. That's the whole weather war thing that someone asked a question about a few dry docks ago. Without a lot of weather information coming from the U-boats, well, not only is it much more difficult to work out whether the U-boats will be effective or not, but also it actually has a little bit of a knock-on impact on German operations in France and so forth, because, you know, if you see a big weather front and it's like, oh, well, this wolf pack can't operate at the moment because of high seas and horrible winds, and a couple of days later it's this one, and a couple of days, oh, right, it's heading this way. So in a couple of more days' time, guess what? The Luftflotte in France are going to be grounded. Or the weather might be really good, and so on and so forth. Then you also have the fact that, well, if the U-boats don't transmit as much, then the Germans don't know where they are, which means if German intelligence gets word of, well, there's an Allied convoy heading in this direction, well, can we send U-boats to intercept it? Are there U-boats in its path? Well, if they haven't transmitted for a couple of weeks, we don't know. There might be. There might be several hundred miles away. They might be 500 miles away. Who knows? Although the flip side, of course, to that is that, you know, if the Germans don't know where the U-boats are, then the British also don't know where the U-boats are. And so if no one knows where the U-boats are, it's almost impossible to redirect convoys to miss the U-boats because, well, you might miss them, you might sail past them entirely, and they have no way of being redirected, but you might also hit them completely unexpectedly. So, as you can see, there would have been upsides and downsides for both parties. So the overall impact on the Battle of the Atlantic is highly questionable, because it could have overall net benefited the Allies quite significantly by allowing making sure that the U-boats weren't redirected to intercept Allied convoys anywhere near as often. The flip side is it might have benefited the U-boats greatly, because it made it much more difficult for the Allies to work out where the U-boats were. And if more U-boats survive, then there are more U-boats able to operate, which means they can cover wider areas of the sea, which makes it less likely for things to slip past them, and so on and so forth. Now, if you were gonna say, okay, Drac, you be Doenitz, you tell us how you would have done it, well, obviously this would require a little bit more pre-war planning, but personally, and obviously operating with an awful lot of hindsight here, I would have run operations in a kind of hybrid manner. So what I would have done is build a lot more supply U-boats to start with, the Milku type 14s. Build a huge amount more of them right from the beginning, maybe even bigger versions, and have them scattered about. And their sole job is to act as, you know, reload and refuel points for the rest of my U-boats, and also as mobile weather stations. And I would station these ships or subs in areas that I know to be well outside of Allied convoy lanes. So the other U-boats will have to go a little way to restock and refuel, but it means if I start transmitting weather reports and so forth, the chances of anyone either being able to get an HFDF fix or being anywhere close enough to do anything about it are relatively remote. So they're my weather station reports. No one else is having to do anything about that. The other thing I would do is, give the U-boats a little bit more operational freedom. Tell them roughly where I think they should go based on intelligence, but instead of requiring them to report back their positions every day or whatever so that I can map out exactly where they are, I would instead just broadcast, obviously encrypted, but broadcast the intelligence I've got on where Allied convoys are. So instead of, this U-boat, that U-boat, and the other U-boat, you tell me where you are, and then I'll send you each specific orders where to go in order to find an Allied convoy. It would just be transmissions out of occupied France to say, okay, attention any and all U-boats in this area. We believe a convoy is coming through in roughly this position. If you happen to be in the area and able to concentrate to attack it, please do so. Otherwise, disregard this message. And so on and so forth. And that way, you're going to build up a clearer idea of where Allied convoys are anyway. So you'd be issuing U-boats with maps saying, well, this is roughly where they all seem to go. And then allow the captains their own freedom to decide when and where they're going to attack. Now, on the one hand, that means you're going to get more 1 and 2 U-boat attacks, which may be harder for the U-boats to pull off, especially once escort numbers start to increase. But then the flip side is, if you listen to the series I did on Johnny Walker, one of the things that was really exhausting about fighting the U-boat campaign was having attack after attack after attack after attack, and having a big wolf pack attack goes in. Yeah, the number of U-boats might make things very difficult, but ultimately that battle would be done and dusted in 24 to 48 hours. Whereas if you have roughly that same number of U-boats but strung out across much of the Atlantic, then you're being attacked day after day after day after day, even if it's only by one or two at a time. I think there's an argument there to say that perhaps you might end up exhausting the escort crews, and so the effectiveness of your subs will go up and up and up as time went on, which in and of itself might actually then necessitate a shift in tactics, because then you could then say to the U-boat crews, well, if you happen to be so far west in the Atlantic, then maybe you want to concentrate on trying to knock off the escorts rather than sneak past them and potentially get hit by them, versus the further east you go, hopefully at that point the escorts will be diminished and or exhausted, and then the U-boats further east go after the merchant ships. But that's just one way you could play things. Marlin Stout asks, I was thinking about the use by the Imperial Japanese Navy and later by the US Navy of light carriers. The Imperial Japanese Navy seems to have used them either to back up fleet carriers or to provide air cover for surface and transport forces. My question is this: would it have been better for these navies, or other navies, to outfit light carriers with only fighters in order to provide combat air patrols for their formations, as most light carriers have very small complements of strike aircraft to start with, usually around a dozen planes, which wouldn't seem to offer a particularly large chance of damaging an enemy, and these could in most cases be replaced by a larger number of fighters. When operating alongside fleet carriers, this would in theory let the CVLs provide air cover, leaving more of the CV's fighters to cover strike missions. This might even let the Japanese Navy's battle carriers have a useful role if you stuff them to the gills with fighters and let those fighters defend the surface fleet. Well, there's two interleaving things here. Part of the reason the Japanese Navy's use of light carriers is slightly different to the US Navy's, apart from doctrinal issues, is that the Japanese Navy's light carriers are a whole bunch of different conversions. So they have varying speeds. Some are almost able to keep up with the fleet carriers, others are significantly slower, whereas the US, of course, is using the Independences, which basically are fast enough to keep up with the fleet carriers, and as a near uniform class, you have a pretty standard set air group that you can deploy on them. And part of that lack of homogeneity in the Japanese fleet is air group sizes. But in theory, and you have heard me mention this a few times on the Drydock and elsewhere, yes, I think a fighter carrier definitely would have been a very useful idea in the early to mid part of World War II, particularly the mid part. And in fact, the Royal Navy agreed when they were initially designing the 1942 Light Fleet Carrier program, as I covered in the aircraft carrier design video. They were first looking at it being a pure fighter carrier to escort other ships and to take out incoming strike aircraft, for pretty much the reasons that you specified. The only limitation with this is that you are restricting your light carriers to a couple of very specific roles, either providing fighter cover for a transport or surface force, or providing combat air patrol for a carrier force. If you have a pure fighter carrier, it cannot obviously conduct strike missions, at least until the last part of the war with some of the US light carriers, when you're able to load up Wildcats and Hellcats with rockets and bombs and so forth. But nonetheless, most of the time you're only going to conduct fighter type missions, and that means that you can't really send them out alone in areas where you know that you might be contested by significant enemy forces, because ultimately, let's say you have a light carrier that can take roughly 24 aircraft in a standard mix, and maybe it can take 30 with fighters, or maybe it could take 20 strike and fighter aircraft, but it could take 30 fighters. Great, fantastic. You now have a very fighter heavy vessel, but a full-size fleet carrier like a Yorktown, Lexington, Shikaku, or Essex can carry roughly the same number, if not more, in fighters. So even if you're just going 1v1, and fleet carriers tend to show up in more than one. But even if you are just going 1v1, assuming all other things being equal, you can exhaust your fighter complement fighting their fighter complement, and then they have strike aircraft as well. So the best way to stop them sending strike aircraft your way is, of course, to have your own strike aircraft to hit back. And thus, if you're going to operate alone, you need your own strike aircraft, hence the reasoning for deploying strike aircraft on most light carriers. And the other factor, at least for the larger ones like the Independences, is that as the war goes on and people are adopting more and more of the start of the Pacific Campaign Japanese style of things, i.e. launch a batch of aircraft from every carrier and send them off, well, at that point, having strike aircraft on your light carriers, even in small numbers, does make a certain amount of sense, because if everybody's launching some aircraft, well, if you want a really big heavy strike wave, even if you only launch half a dozen Avengers, well, if you're doing that and the 6 other light fleet carriers are doing that, and the fleet carriers are also doing that, well, the fleet carriers can potentially launch more than one aircraft at a time, or launch them a bit quicker because of their size advantages. So maybe they should be the ones launching the fighters, and you launch strike aircraft, and then as and when you need lots of combat air patrol, you can launch your own fighters as well. So there are definitely good reasons for having strike capability in light carriers, but if you are prepared to restrict your light carriers to essentially surface warship and fleet carrier escort operations, then yes, you would have a potential role of just purely loading them up with fighters. But that also presupposes you have enough pilots to man all those fighters. If the gods had meant us to be happy, they would have given us a honey-based alcoholic beverage. Oh Look Mead asks, Saving Ships from the Breakers Yards, Part 4, 1890 to 1900. Between these years, which 3 to 5 ships, either built at the time or modernised at the time, would you have saved from the Breakers Yards based on engineering grounds, if they're the first successful example of a capability or ship type, if they're the archetype of a ship type, or they're just so hilariously bad everyone should mock them for all eternity? So this is similar to a question that was answered a little while back. So I'm going to try and give some slightly different ships for various reasons. Now, to be fair, 1890 to 1900, I'm going to mostly be selecting ships because they're really out there. So not a lot of standard ships, and you'll see why. So my first choice would be either HMS Powerful or HMS Terrible. This is Powerful, if you're interested. Just monstrously large protected cruisers, and of course one of them has a rather famous escapade in sending its guns to relieve the siege of Ladysmith, so there's a certain amount of rather important history behind them, but also they're just really funny examples of Victorian over-engineering. They're kind of almost the epitome of the Royal Navy's period when it was just building occasional ships to reply to specific other ships that happen to exist. I would also therefore preserve one of the Matsushima class cruisers. Whether you want to preserve one with a gun pointing backwards or one of the ones with a gun pointing forwards, that's up to you, but let's all do the Conga ship style. Yeah, that definitely deserves some preservation. They're a little bit mad, but yeah, definitely something to preserve. Although, of course, if you preserve one or the other, you don't get the full appreciation of quite how mad. I'd also keep the original, at least as far as the Steel Navy is concerned, USS Texas, partly because it'd be incredibly funny to put her up next to the Dreadnought USS Texas as a nice comparison, but also because she's one of the very last examples of a ship not with necessarily strictly with an echelon style fire, although she kind of sort of can, but more of this centralized turret battery, because of course she doesn't have main battery guns fore and aft like the Espanias or the Invincibles or a number of other ships from the next decade or so. So she's kind of almost the last of the development that you see with ships like Inflexible earlier on. So a rather interesting, if somewhat short-lived trend in warship design, which would be very interesting to keep. And, well, there's a lot of cruisers being kept around in this stage, but here is Depuis de l'Homme. So first French armoured cruiser, so a certain amount of historical nous to it there, right at the beginning of the 1890s. But also just look at it. It's so wonderfully French. Look at that ridiculously large ram bow. Well, it's not technically actually a ram. it is partly a roundabout, but it's actually there more so to extend the hull's waterline and thus make it more efficient moving at speed without all the additional weight of, actually having to fill in a bit above the waterline. But yeah, it's certainly unique and interesting, and I think it would make a very interesting museum ship. Note I'm not preserving any of the French pre-dreadnoughts in this particular answer. And then my final pick is probably the most conventional of all of them, and that would be HMS Majestic, almost entirely on the grounds that as the Majestic, lead ship of the Majestic class, she is the very first pre-dreadnought, assuming that you don't think the Royal Sovereigns are pre-dreadnoughts, or they're more kind of late period ironclads or right on the border thereof. But in any case, most people would say that the Majestic class are the first true pre-dreadnoughts, and therefore I think one of them needs to be preserved as a sort of commemoration of that, much in the same way as you'd preserve Dreadnought herself the decade following. Jellicoe Katz asks, the ship's purser question got me wondering what ships travelling to India and other Asian ports of call ate on the way home. Were there European-style bakeries that produced ship's biscuits, or did they tend to stock up on things like rice and taro root? It would be a mixture of things. Partly, I mean, it obviously depends on how long they've been out there, but partly some ships would be carrying enough supplies for the journey back as well, at least in terms of the heavily preserved stuff like ship's biscuit. Especially if you're talking about something like a merchant ship that's just going to and from direct. If you're talking about, however, warships that are perhaps on station for a long time overseas before coming home, there would be some usage of, if you like, local foods. One of the problems per se with having something like rice is that although rice stored dry will keep for quite a while, you do have to boil it up with water, and well, fresh water is not exactly the easiest thing to find on an Asia sail ship that's out at sea for long periods. So if it was perhaps patrolling the trade routes in and around India, so might be expected to make fairly regular port visits, they might actually have rice on board at that point for a while, because you can regularly restock your fresh water to help prepare it. But for the long journey home, it might very well be something that was just prepared initially and then ran out. A lot of places, even as far east as India and the Dutch East Indies and so forth, they had trading stations manned by Europeans, which were often at the time called factories, not in the modern sense of like a manufacturing industrial place, but a factory essentially as in somewhere that goods come from. And there's a few other etymological roots around it, but that's what they're called anyway. So it'll be relatively easy to have something like, an oven capable of producing ship's biscuit, because ultimately it'd be the same oven as an oven you use to produce bread and stuff. It's just you put a slightly different mixture in and leave it there for longer. And you can see this when you look at ship's logs from that kind of time period. Very often there would be a core of long-term preserved goods which tended to be basically European style in most cases, but if you were on a long-term deployment to a very distant overseas station, that would kind of be supplemented and overlaid by a lot of more local stuff being served on the kind of ad hoc as acquired basis. Now, of course, rice in particular would actually become much more of a widely found staple on British ships as time went on, but that tends to be more so with the advent of both better water storage and also initial water production, desalination, etc. Peter Guy asks, how did nations that purchased capital ships from traditional naval powers such as the UK and France in the late 19th and early 20th centuries repair such ships if they needed major repairs? I imagine that if the repairs were relatively minor, they could do them on their own, but what would they do if the ship needed major repairs like replacing a damaged portion of the armour belt, repairing a hull caused by a torpedo, or relining a gun barrel? If they lacked the dry dock facilities and industry to construct such a ship, I can't imagine they had the means to perform any such repairs. Would they have to return the ship to manufacturer for refurbishment? It depends very much on the nature of the ship and the scale of the repairs, because sometimes when ships were ordered, it wasn't necessarily that the nation in question lacked the capacity to build a ship of that nature, but they perhaps lacked access to the most advanced technology for a ship of that nature, or the most advanced designs. So for example, Argentinian, Chilean, Brazilian shipyards would have been able to churn out a torpedo boat or a small destroyer to a reasonable degree in the very late 19th and early 20th centuries, but they didn't necessarily have access to the latest and greatest in destroyer design or the latest and greatest in turbines, etc., etc. And even if they might be able to import some of that, there obviously would be certain costs involved, because if you wanted, let's say, again, using the example of a destroyer, if you wanted the latest guns, you'd have to import those. And if you wanted the latest design, well, you'd have to either pay for someone to draw that up overseas or hire a designer to come and design in-house. Then you'd have to pay a premium to the turbine manufacturers and ship them across. So you'd be individually shipping lots of different components over to your yards. And ultimately, your yardsmen might not have the experience to put together all of these latest and greatest components in one thing. Whereas if you just pay a bunch of money to someone overseas, then, well, they ship everything to that yard in their own country, put it together, and then the ship comes over to you. So it's just easier, not necessarily that it's strictly impossible to do. Now, of course, when you start scale things up to the size of battleships, then perhaps some things are beyond capacity. But again, then it comes down to the nature of the repairs. So if you're talking about structural repairs, so you've been in battle, someone's punched a hole in the side of your hull, this is not good. Well, that kind of repair could usually be done in local shipyards. When it comes to torpedo hits, it would depend on the size of the ship and whether or not you had access to a dry dock big enough. If you did, then again, general structural repairs entirely doable. If you didn't have access to a dry dock, then more of a problem. Gun barrels, well, you would purchase some spares, so your initial thing would just be to swap out for one that you had in stock, assuming you have access to powerful enough cranes to move the gun barrels around, which was something of a problem when there was initially the South American pre-Dreadnought arms race. When that was brought to an end by Britain, one of the problems they faced was actually there weren't any heavy lift cranes in South America capable of disarming some of the ships they'd agreed to disarm, but nonetheless. And then at some point, when you're talking about really sensitive, complicated stuff like turbines or entire gun turrets disabled, or perhaps you've burnt through your stockpile of spare guns, then indeed ships would have to go back to their home country for repair and refit. And you kind of see this with the various South American dreadnoughts, so the Rivadavias, Minas Gerais, and Almirante Latorre classes. A fair bit, although they don't really face battle, but a fair bit of their day-to-day maintenance, or lack thereof, is done in their various nations' yards. But when it comes to big overhauls or something going really dramatically wrong, they tend to head back to the UK, or in the Rivadavia's case, the States, for those bigger bits of work. Lord Druken asks, I was sorting through some of my old Lego sets and I came across 2 ship kits from the late 1980s Pirates line. Oh, I missed that. Based on the design of each, how would the kits named the Caribbean Clipper and the Black Seas Barracuda be classified in the Age of Sail? Okay, so here's the Caribbean Clipper. Now this is interesting because you might immediately think brig because there's 2 masts. However, you'll notice that there aren't actually any yards for square sails on the aft mast, which is technically the main mast because you start with foremast, then main mast. Obviously there's no mizzen in this one because there's only the 2. In theory, she's fitted perhaps for a lateen type sail aft, but the fact that she lacks square rig on both masts makes her not a brig. And you can see there that she has, well, 2 guns on the broadside, so in theory capacity for being a 4-gun ship, maybe, if that forward port there could also fit a gun. I mean, I don't think the actual model can, but in theory that's potentially an opening, so maybe a 6-gunner. But either way, a 4 to a 6-gunner, she's a fairly small ship. And the thing is, she's not a brigandine either, because she doesn't have a square topsail on the aft mast. Also, the aft mast, the main mast, is smaller than the forward mast, but she is closer to a brigandine sailing pattern than she is a brig. However, if she came with a sail for that aft mast in the fore and aft manner, which I mentioned earlier, which she certainly seems set up for, although I don't think she ever shipped with, that would actually make her a schooner brig. And I think that's about the closest you're going to get. Now, the Black Sea's Barracuda, as you can see here, is a substantially larger model, but interestingly enough, is actually pierced for the same number of guns. You can see a 2-gun broadside, potentially a bow chaser as well, so maybe a 6-gunner, possibly a 4-gunner, although there is space along her hull to make her perhaps an 8 to 10-gunner, but ultimately she has 2 masts, both with square sails, and as you can see, with the ability to set a lot of fore and aft sails as well. So this makes her a classic brig-rigged vessel. So she's definitely a brig, albeit a fairly substantially built up one aft, because ultimately these are Lego ships. Although it's interesting to note that despite these ships' relatively small size compared to even the 6th rate frigate, this is actually more like what you would typically see pirates actually sailing in, at least in terms of overall firepower and sail plan. The bigger and more successful pirates might carry ships, or might have ships that carry guns in the double digits, but for smaller scale piracy, this isn't actually too far off, at least as I say, in terms of number of guns and rig, to what you'd see historically. Vokir asks, can you give us a brief rundown on the history of spotlights and searchlights in naval circles? When were they first deployed? And were they often used to illuminate aircraft as well as ships? So specifically looking at searchlights and so forth, the very first uses of any kind of large electrical light to try and illuminate something at night came about in the 1860s. The problem at that point was that the light was very diffuse. It wasn't yet possible, at least at the scale that they wanted to concentrate it into any kind of cone or beam with which to search a particularly long distance. So you could illuminate close to your ship, or maybe barely illuminate things a medium distance from your ship, but that was about it. Then fast forward through the 1870s and you get the mirrored reflector and various other things being invented, and in the late 1860s you also get the start of the use of signal lights, as in for signaling Morse code and so forth, because that's somewhat easier, because you don't need a particularly focused light at that point. You just need the other person to see the light and then blink on and off Morse code or whatever you want to use. In any case, by the early 1880s, incorporating the reflector and the increasing power of electrical lights, you begin to see the first searchlights and spotlights deployed in various navies, particularly, of course, the British and the French, because they're the largest and most technologically advanced. And initially, they're actually used in quite an offensive role. For example, in the early 1880s, they're used to dazzle the gunners in enemy forts so that they can't shoot back, which is quite useful and also allows you to sight in on targets at night. And there's even some amphibious landings that are done under the cover of searchlights, both in terms of, hey, that's where the shore is, you probably want to go that way, and also, oh, those people are shooting at you. Here, let me shine the power of 1,000 blazing suns at them so they can't see you, or anything else for that matter. And it pretty much goes on in that manner for a little while. People begin to realize, hey, well, if we can use them on forts, we can also use them to find ships at sea. And the French use a fairly powerful light in that manner over in the Far East. The problem, of course, is that once everybody has searchlights, well, then you can see a searchlight, and therefore you could potentially shoot at it. Now, this is kind of the catch-22 situation here, because if you make a searchlight more diffuse, so you can potentially illuminate and dazzle the entire ship, of course its power is less, so you'd need a much more powerful light to actually blind the people who are looking in your direction. Whereas to reach out with a focused enough blinding light, you really want it to be a tighter focus beam, but that means you can illuminate a ship, you can dazzle part of it, but not all of it, which means you need more searchlights or more ships with searchlights. And indeed, there are a few exercises in the latter part of the 19th century where they experiment with the potential of maybe being able to bypass narrow choke points like harbour entrances or the Dardanelles at night, simply by having the entire fleet train, of whatever nation, train their searchlights on the fort. So you have multiple searchlights illuminating the entire thing with a huge amount of light. The idea, of course, then being, well, they can't see anything, therefore they can't shoot at us. And it does seem to work, at least for a little bit, at the short ranges of ships of the time. The problem at that point, of course, becomes once you get to the end of the 19th century and ranges begin to increase dramatically, it's all you can do to get the searchlights to actually reach out that far with any kind of coherency. And of course, the intensity begins to be a little bit lost, and searchlights become much more for illumination or counter illumination. And also, you're hoping that you're not painting a big target on yourself by using them, which becomes a major concern. But outside of emergencies, you might be surprised to know that spotlights and searchlights on naval vessels are generally not used against aircraft at night, simply because anti-aircraft fire control systems at night, until right up at the very end of the time period the channel covers, are not really up to all that much. At which point, having lights of any description, let alone a massive great searchlight, is a very easy way of highlighting where you are for an enemy aircraft. So a warship's best defense against a night attacker, unless you have radar-directed anti-aircraft fire control, is to hide, i.e. to be as invisible as possible, and that means actually dousing all of your lights. Now, of course, if you're faced with a situation where you don't really have much choice, let's say it's a clear night, full moon, and it's fairly obvious that the enemy aircraft can see you, there may be a percentage in trying to dazzle them with a searchlight, but by that stage we're basically talking about World War II aircraft moving pretty quickly, and being able to hold an aircraft in a searchlight beam in a way that would actually, properly dazzle the pilot and make him less able to pull off his attack when your ship's pitching and rolling and so forth, it's relatively unlikely. So it's more of a chance rather than a specific doctrine. Yokosuka Girls Marine High School Training Vessel Harakaze asks, back in Drydock 257, Part 1, you recount the amusing tale of Birmingham and Folkestone turning up and getting a British freighter out of some trouble with the Japanese. Can you give a few more examples where this sort of thing happened? There are actually surprisingly few incidents that I would say directly parallel the standoff between the Royal Navy and the Imperial Japanese Navy in that particular incident. There are a lot of similar incidents where someone wants something, someone else says no, there's elements of both navies involved, and there's a standoff, but almost all of them usually end in gunfire when there's both navies present. And that actually makes the Tsingtao incident rather unique, in that the whole thing ended without people being shot at. I suppose there was a kind of, but not quite as tense standoff during the evacuation of the Portuguese royal family in the latter part of the 1800s, i.e. towards 1810, because the Russians had been on Britain's side against Napoleon. Then the Tsar concluded a treaty with Napoleon that basically he switched sides, and that meant Admiral Senyavin's squadron was broken up. Some of it remained in the Mediterranean, more accurately it was sent back to Sevastopol. The rest of it was told to go around to the Baltic to fight the Swedes. But thanks to bad weather, his squadron fetched up in Lisbon, right around the time that the French were in the process of basically chucking the Portuguese royal family and government out of Portugal. And that led to a bit of a problem, because Senyavin had fought quite happily alongside the British for quite a while, and he really didn't like the fact that all his hard work against the French and on behalf of Russia had been upset by this sudden switching of sides. In theory, though, since Russia was now allied with France and Portugal was allied with Britain, he should stop the Portuguese fleet from embarking the Portuguese royal family, treasury, government officials, etc., and making off for Brazil. However, into all of this, you had Admiral Sidney Smith rock up with a detachment from the Royal Navy, and the combined Anglo-Portuguese fleet, even though, as I said, the Portuguese fleet was being used as much for transportation as anything else, significantly outgunned Senyavin's force. And so deciding that discretion was the better part of valour, although all sides were kind of eyeing each other warily, it ended up being the situation that a theoretically French-aligned naval squadron with full command of a firing range over the Anglo-Portuguese fleet, which in turn had a very significant number of guns pointed at the French-aligned Russian forces, kind of sailed past each other and then out into the Atlantic, or at least the Anglo-Portuguese fleet did, which is then where the Portuguese government in exile in Brazil ended up being set up for quite a while. Seb Dove asks, during the interwar fleet exercises such as the US Navy's fleet problems, how was the effectiveness of fighter aircraft against other aircraft judged? I have to assume it wasn't just pilots saying dagger, dagger, dagger through the radio. Further, how was the effectiveness of each aircraft attack against ships judged, and did it differ between different navies? Unfortunately, it's all a little bit of a moving target, no pun intended. Sometimes, when it came to attacks on ships, it would be a case of, okay, here's a flower bomb or a test torpedo, actually launch an attack and we'll see how many hits are actually scored. Now, of course, that's a little bit of an artificial environment because the anti-aircraft fire isn't actually shooting your aircraft down. So then a percentage would be applied based on what the Navy thought was likely. So, let's say you attack with a dozen torpedo bombers and 4 test torpedoes are seen to hit, and they think, well, I reckon anti-aircraft fire would have shot down at least half of those attackers, so actually we're just going to count that as 2. But it varies quite considerably, not just by Navy, but even by year. So the reason I can't give you a strict answer is that if you look at, for example, the Fleet Problem Guidelines, which you can find on the US National Archives website, the guidelines for how the umpires are supposed to judge aerial combat change on pretty much a yearly basis, because you've got to remember that aerial combat, for the purposes of war games or military exercises, is a completely new thing in the 1920s. Aerial combat's only been invented the previous decade, so they'll start off with one system, and then everyone will complain about it, so they'll change it the next year, and so on and so forth. And it's the same thing, not just aerial combat, but for attacks against ships. There's this whole ongoing argument between aviators, the umpires, and the crews of surface ships as to how effective their attack should be. Because sometimes, obviously, you don't necessarily want to start lobbing flower bombs and such at your ships. So sometimes it would just be dummy attack runs, and it would be a case of, well, X percentage of the dummy attack runs successfully executed will be counted as hits. But how do you count that percentage? Is it 10, 20%? Is it 10%? Is it 40%? At one point, they try and rationalize it by saying, well, in the US Navy at least, so dive bombers will hit at roughly the same rate as capital ship gunfire is judged to hit. But then, obviously, the aviators say, well, actually, we think dive bombing is going to be more accurate than that. And the Navy officers say, oh, well, actually, we think between anti-aircraft fire and the ability to evade, we think dive bombing will be less effective than that. And so the arguments go on and on and on. And, with fighters attacking, very often it would be a case of umpires having to watch and follow the combat and go, well, they're maneuvered on each other's tails and there's the enemy fighters and so forth. So I think that maybe I saw half a dozen successful interceptions and so I'm going to say maybe 2/3 of those were shot down. So 4 aircraft were shot down. So we might have had a dozen dive bombers, let's say, and 8 of them successfully executed a dive bombing run. But I think that maybe 2 of those were probably shot down by fighters before they got here. So that's 6. And if we apply a 1/3 successful margin this year, well, that means there's been 2 hits, despite the fact that actually 8 aircraft might have made that dive. And then the next year it will be completely different again. So yeah, there was a lot of refinement going on. RJ Blaine asks, did sails stretching have any real issue on ships during the Age of Sail? I've heard of some sails being made of denim. So how would this affect a ship? Well, denim is a cotton-based cloth, and there certainly were cotton sails in the 19th century, particularly. So, yeah, denim would have been one of the options available for sails, because, of course, you don't want sails to be too light and too vulnerable to damage, because otherwise they'll just rip apart. So you still need a relatively heavy cloth. But one of the attractions of cotton sails, and by extension therefore denim sails, versus canvas, at least traditional canvas made of hemp, was that even a relatively heavy material for a cotton sail was still lighter usually than the canvas was. Now, of course, sails will stretch slightly under load, but generally speaking, because you have them made out of a fairly heavy cloth, and you don't want them stretching too much, because obviously if they stretch considerably, they'll essentially start to leak. But you don't want them completely unstretchable, because otherwise you won't be able to take full advantage of the sail's ability to naturally deform under wind to catch as much wind as humanly possible. And the fact that sails are somewhat porous to the air can be seen from the fact that in particularly light airs, but also in some other circumstances, wetting the sails down to improve their draw was a thing that was tried, because, well, among other things, if you wet the sail down, then obviously the water fills in some of those gaps, which improves its air retention. But you'd usually want the sail to then retract back to roughly its original shape. So you'd want elastic deformation rather than plastic deformation. So when you perhaps look at some photos, particularly photos, obviously paintings can be open to artistic interpretation, but if you look at some photos of later period, at least sort of mid to late 19th century ships with their sails set but no or little wind, you'll see that they are pretty much, with a little bit of variation, rectangular or trapezoid sheets of cloth. And then when they're billowing out and the ship is under sail, while there will be a little bit of curvature upwards, as you can see in this picture of USS New Ironsides, when you actually look at the curvature forwards as well as upwards, you realize that there's no way that the sail can actually do that if it's not stretching somewhat. Now, obviously, if a sail does stretch too much, as I said, air will start to get through and you'll start to have problems. But this was one of the marks of quality. This is why certain materials were used. Hemp for canvas for a lot of it, and then cotton for sails later on, specifically because they have some give, but not enough to cause serious problems. Cameron asks, there are several videos of torpedoes on the channel, but I'm curious when they fell out of favour on different systems. I know torpedoes on battleships ended mostly during World War II designs, and given that modern submarines still use them, when were they discontinued on other forms of ships? For example, cruisers, destroyers, or even on aircraft, and what took their place? So torpedoes on newly designed battleships pretty much come to an end with the end of World War I and the beginning of the interwar period. Nelson and Rodney being some of the last battleships to have torpedoes built into them by design. By the time you get to the other end of the interwar period and the treaty battleships, torpedoes aboard new battleships aren't really a thing, with the exception of turpits, and that's a retrofit to assist with merchant raiding rather than part of the original design. For aircraft, the torpedo or the aerial torpedo falls out of favour relatively swiftly, but over a period of the late 1940s and early 1950s. The Russians are some of the last to hold on to aerial torpedoes. Some of the IL-28s have them, but broadly speaking, even with the advances in dropping them higher and faster that the US has made, the fundamental problem they have is that you still have to get relatively close to a ship and fly on a kind of level and straight course to drop your torpedo. And with the advent of radar fire control and the lower end of heavy anti-aircraft guns getting fully automatic, and then later the heavy AA also getting fully automatic, so we're talking like 3-inch full autos and then later 5-inch, yeah, suddenly flying in a dead straight line within easy range of lots of those guns is not the best tactic for survivability. And that's coupled with the advent of jet aircraft and everyone going all singing, all dancing on the jet age. And that poses its own issues, because a lot of early jet aircraft
and to be honest, even these days, a lot of jet aircraft would have stall speeds that are higher than your highest possible launch speed for a lot of torpedoes. Now, again, some American advances with dropping the Mark 13 would allow a jet aircraft to theoretically drop a torpedo. The Russians obviously pulled it off. You can also try things like parachutes and so forth, but ultimately a jet aircraft's major asset over the old prop-driven aircraft is speed, and you do have to drop your speed quite a bit to launch a torpedo, at which point you become vulnerable, and a big expensive jet aircraft then becomes a very easy target. On cruisers, the torpedo is beginning to go out of fashion towards the end of the Second World War and is very quickly removed on remaining cruisers, pretty much in parallel with the aerial torpedo, actually. So, for example, in the Korean War, HMS Belfast loses her torpedoes but keeps the launchers just in case they might need them again. And then later on in the 50s, she loses her torpedo launchers as well. And that's partly because, well, what is the purpose of a torpedo launcher on a cruiser? It's mostly to give the cruiser punch against a big capital ship. And what do the NATO navies know they're not facing off against as the 40s turn into the 50s? Well, it's Soviet capital ships, because they know they don't exist. And against something like a Sverdlov, well, guns are a better solution at that stage. And since torpedoes and their launchers are quite heavy, and you need lots of other things like radar and anti-aircraft guns and all these other things added up top, they get landed and then eventually replaced entirely pretty quickly. On destroyers, though, they hang around for a considerably longer period because there are still cruisers out there, and therefore destroyers, whose anti-capital ship punch comes from the torpedo, retain torpedo launchers, albeit perhaps fewer of them, perhaps one launcher instead of two, for considerably longer. But as the number of cruisers in service starts to drop, and also the advent of anti-shipping missiles, which are, in terms of giving a small ship punch against a bigger ship, are kind of like torpedoes, only a lot faster and longer range, then you start to see the use of torpedoes drop off, because now getting that close to a ship that's potentially not just armed with big guns but also anti-shipping missiles becomes a little bit suicidal. And on destroyers, actually, the torpedo technically doesn't go away, but it does get replaced with much smaller anti-submarine specific torpedo launchers rather than big anti-surface units. And generally speaking, on some larger ships as well, you have things like Azrock and Ikara, where torpedo launchers of a sort are still there. It's just now that they are rocket or jet assisted, and again, it's more about dropping torpedoes on submarines than it is against surface ships. The Russians are a little bit slower to get rid of torpedoes as a rule, but that's because they have much bigger NATO Navy targets to potentially shoot at. But pretty much the replacement for the torpedo really is the anti-shipping missile, which, as I said, it does everything a torpedo theoretically can do, only faster and longer range, with the sole exception of putting holes below the waterline rather than above. Reichspear Minister asks, regarding my last question from February, I want to know how electrical power, for example for tools, changed the job of a ship's carpenter or engineer. When did power tools become available, and what did they look like? Were there already electrical sockets distributed over the ship, and were there special tools developed for naval use? Well, it depends what you mean by power tools, because if you mean an electrically powered tool that ship's carpenters and engineers could use, yeah, there were a fair number of them on ships, especially by World War II, but they tended to look like this. This is a lathe found aboard USS North Carolina. They'd be mostly concentrated in ship's workshops. Yes, there would be electrical sockets usually distributed over the ship, connected to the ship's power grid for the powering up of various bits of equipment. But although there were some electrical hand tools, power tools, available, again, these would mostly be confined to the ship's workshop. You could use them elsewhere on the ship during peacetime or times when you were perhaps not at action stations and so forth. But although there were naval specialized ones, with a bit more waterproofing and perhaps chrome and such to protect against rust, the simple fact is that in a battle situation, using electrical hand tools is, generally speaking, a pretty dumb idea on two major grounds. Firstly, if you need to use tools aboard a ship during action stations, that, or general quarters, that probably means you're repairing damage, part of a damage control crew. That in turn means that there's a fairly high likelihood that that area of the ship has a either non-existent or very heavily interrupted and warbling power supply, neither of which are good things to try and plug an electrical tool into. And secondly, being the nature of ships, there's probably water getting around. And, well, I don't really need to draw a picture to illustrate why having a malfunctioning electrical grid, a corded hand power tool, and a bunch of water might end badly for everybody concerned. So at that point, you really want to be using hand tools because, yes, they might be slower, but you can't get an electrical shock off of a handsaw. You can get an electrical shock off of a power saw. And even when you look at things like lights for damage control, the vast majority of electrical lights used are battery-powered hand units, not theoretically more powerful plug-in units, for pretty much the same reasons I just described. And even when you look in the late 1950s, there's US Navy regulations and manuals basically saying, look, the usage of electrical hand tools aboard a ship is incredibly dangerous because of the risk of shorting out and so forth and giving yourself a really nasty shock. And essentially using lots and lots of paragraphs to say, just use the hand tools and keep, the manual ones, and keep the electrical stuff in the workshop, because otherwise things are probably not going to end well. And to be fair, they've kind of got a point, because let's face it, if you're trying to drill through something, let's say a bit of metal to rivet something in or wire something through or whatever in the middle of a fraught situation, well, massive, great motors, bigger than both your fists put together, with no clutch and no safety, you're much more likely to get a broken wrist than you are to do anything particularly useful at that stage, even if you're trying to use it as a gigantic screwdriver. That they're the kind of things that can and will, if they don't break your wrist, just fling you across a room rather than anything else. And, having played around with my grandfather's 1950s Black and Decker drill, which was a decade after World War II, yeah, that thing commands respect in a way that a modern power drill really doesn't. Christopher Dooley asks, is there a naval equivalent of the Ypres battlefield? I'm thinking of some relatively small area of water that saw multiple battles during the course of a war or campaign. The only place that springs to mind immediately is the waters around Savo Island, but I'm sure there must be others. Well, it depends if you want to confine yourself to just one war or several. I mean, the waters of the English Channel were the site of endless actions between MTBs and MGBs on one side and the occasional USPT boat, and German Schnellboote, or S-boats, or E-boats as the Allies called them. And of course, the Arctic convoys, all sailing on a fairly confined set of routings, repeatedly attacked by the Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine. And if you want to go through multiple conflicts, the area of water around Ushant is, well, it's a multi-generational naval Ypres battlefield. There have been at least 7 significant engagements that have been termed the Battle of Ushant, of which 5 have been fairly major naval battles, simply because, well, look at where Ushant is off the coast of France, and you suddenly realise in the age of sail, it's basically a huge flashpoint. But there was even a Battle of Ushant in World War II. Cody774 asks, would the deck armour of capital ships in World War I and World War II be face-hardened, similar to the belt armour of the time, and what would be the reasons for or against using it as deck armour? No, deck armour was not face-hardened by and large, and that's pretty much the case with almost all horizontal armour, with one exception, which is the turret roof armour of French battleships in World War II. Now, there are a few reasons for this. Firstly, cost. Face-hardened armour is much more expensive to produce than homogeneous armour because you have to do that extra bit of treatment, and deck armour covers a very large area. Secondly, at the kind of scales that we're talking about in terms of mass attack by battleship shells and so forth, face hardening on relatively thin plates doesn't really help at all. Now, of course, you can get face hardened armour for tanks, which by naval standards is incredibly thin, but tanks are also going up against much smaller shells. And we'll come on to this material issue a little bit later. Then you've also got to consider what kind of stresses and strains the armour is subjected to. Belt armour, which is perpendicular or near enough as makes no difference perpendicular to a ship's structure and is in distinct segments, in distinct blocks, isn't really subject to all that much in terms of bending moments as the ship flexes in the seas. And what it is subjected to, it's very well positioned to resist because it's massively thick. Conversely, deck armour is thinner, therefore is less able to deal with flex. And also, if you think about the relative position of deck armour, if the ship is hogging and sagging as it goes through the water, belt armour is essentially on its side, giving it a really, really strong resistance, whereas deck armour is laying flat, which means it's got its weakest cross-section to resist bending. And of course, if you have a very hard, very brittle face, that's a very easy way to get lots of microfractures or outright cracks in face-hardened armour in certain areas of the ship. And it wouldn't be instant, but it would degrade over time. But to be honest, that's a relatively small concern. You could potentially overcome that with certain measures. I won't go into those there because they'll take the answer well beyond 3 or 4 or 5 minutes or so. But the biggest issue was pretty much the reason why the French are the ones who go with the hardened turret roofs and everybody else kind of doesn't. And it's an argument about oblique attack angles. Because if you think about it, even with an inclined armor belt, generally speaking, a shell is going to hit belt armor at something between direct perpendicular, 90 degrees, and probably approaching maybe 60 degrees, maybe 50 degrees for a really long-range shot against inclined armor. So more of the attack is going to be directed into the armor as opposed to along it, because you can, if you've done physics, you'll know that you can resolve a diagonal force into a perpendicular force and a parallel force. Now, what this has to do with shells is that obviously if you have deck armor or turret roof armor, you flip that around, and almost anything that hits your deck armor is going to be coming in with more of a parallel force than a perpendicular one. And the concern was that an armor-piercing shell hitting a face-hardened deck armor or turret roof armor or any kind of horizontal protection, if the armor is brittle, face-hardened, then yes, there is a chance that the armor might just skip the shell off entirely. But given the mass of metal that would be directly resisting the shell's impact versus the mass of the shell, there is a chance, and a not inconsiderable one, that the armor-piercing cap, particularly the tip of it, might dig in to the brittle face of the armor, pretty much the way it's designed to. And if that did happen, then the shell is going to start to normalize. It's going to rotate about that point where it's dug in, or perhaps even friction welded itself, depending on the speed of materials and a few other things. But in any case, it will start to rotate more towards a perpendicular angle. And of course, the more and more the force is perpendicular against what is ultimately a relatively thin piece of armor compared to belt armor, the more and more chance is that shell is actually going to power its way through. So this is bad. The flip side is, of course, if it does manage to reject the shell, then it's going to reject it pretty much in wholesale, in entire, which is what the French reckoned would happen with the turrets of their capital ships in World War II. Whereas if you have homogeneous armor, which is a lot more ductile, then the armor may deform, or at least so the thinking went, a lot more readily than face-hardened armor would, but because it deforms, there's therefore essentially, crudely speaking, spreading the impact force out over time, not a lot of time, but a little bit more time. And as it flexes, because again, at these very short amounts of time, it is essentially flexing almost like a fabric, it may very well kind of scoop and bounce or otherwise deflect a shell away from it, almost like a rubber mat in some ways, as compared to the harder armour where the shell might bite into it and actually have even more effect. And various tests did seem to support this theory to a certain degree, in that, you know, you could fire a shell at fairly shallow angles against homogeneous armour, and yeah, the armour might be dished in and there might be a big long groove in it, but the shell would ultimately be rejected back up and away, which is obviously a good thing when the interior of the ship's citadel is your magazines and your machinery spaces. And so they decided, well, that's the better way to go about it. And the other thing, actually, but while we're on the subject related to expenses, is that deck armour would take up vastly more area than the belt armour, and therefore per square foot, you know, even if manufacturing, let's say, 3 or 4 inch thick face hardened armour was a little less expensive than manufacturing 12 inch thick, the extra square footage would more than compensate for that. Greg M asks, why did the Royal Navy choose to kill Admiral Byng? They had many other ways to dishonour him rather than charging him with a capital offence with no discretion in sentencing. What were the consequences, intended or not, of Byng's execution? So, as I've covered previously with Byng, Byng's execution was a combination of political expediency plus politicians having actually backed themselves into too much of a corner. Fundamentally, the problem was Byng was not sent out with a fleet that was equipped, repaired, funded, or in any way really capable of doing what he'd been asked to do, and he was hampered every step of the way by officers both aboard and ashore who seemed to be intent on stopping him from accomplishing his mission for their own personal reasons. Which meant that when you ended up with the battle where he faced off against the French, his plan, in theory, was actually quite a good one, but his subordinates failed to implement it properly. Now, of course, you can argue that as the Admiral, it's ultimately up to him to get his subordinates to toe the line and do what he says. However, we are still talking about an era in the Navy that's not too far removed from Admiral Matthews and the Battle of Toulon, where, for, again, personal grudge reasons, one of his subordinates just flat out refused to support him in battle. And so you get this indecisive engagement. The rather battered and ill-equipped British fleet has to go back to Gibraltar to repair and resupply, although you can argue that the time he spent off Minorca after the battle was a time when he should have contacted the garrison ashore and offered them something, which he failed to do. So, but broadly speaking, I wouldn't necessarily say Byng did the best he could in the circumstances, but I would say, given the hand he was dealt, he probably made an 8 out of 10 effort. The problem is that at the time, there was a whole raft of things going wrong for the British, and this latest one essentially meant that the government, the politicians, were at risk of being turned out by the people because, well, they weren't doing a very good job. And so, in the manner of politicians everywhere, they went, let us find a scapegoat to blame so that people won't, lynch us. And they decided that Admiral Byng would be their scapegoat. And so when he arrived back, he was duly charged, because remember, the Admiralty at its upper echelons at this point was very much enmeshed with the government. And really, the only charge you could bring against him was not having done his utmost in the face of the enemy, which was a blanket thing that all officers in the Navy had to do if they faced the enemy. And you could make a credible argument, as I said, because he'd made like an 8 out of 10 effort, that perhaps he hadn't done absolutely everything, his utmost, in the face of the enemy. He'd done what today would be called everything reasonable in the face of the enemy, given the conditions that he was facing, especially with some ships in his own force not really cooperating very much. but it wasn't 110%, and therefore technically he's guilty. And not doing your utmost in the face of the enemy is an automatic capital offence at that point. And so, well, if it can be proven that he is technically guilty, he must therefore be sentenced to be shot. Then everybody involved said, well, yeah, that's technically true, but realistically this is unfair, so we'd like him to be pardoned. However, unfortunately, the government, having made a scapegoat of Byng and managing to get him to be shot, well, sentenced to be shot at this point, he hadn't yet been executed, now faced a bit of a problem, because it became very, very obvious to almost everybody involved exactly how much of a scapegoat Byng was being made, and the fact that realistically probably wasn't anywhere near as much his fault as the government had up until that point made out. And then there was a big backlash coming in from the general public and the Navy, so they tried to get the sentence commuted by clemency. Unfortunately, the Prime Minister had already managed to make an enemy of the King, who was the only one who could exercise clemency, and he couldn't completely tell the whole truth, because realistically a good chunk of the blame for the whole fiasco lay in the fact that the political appointee Admiralty officers ashore had failed to maintain the fleet and get the fleet ready to a proper extent, except now the guy who had been the First Lord of the Admiralty was part of the Prime Minister's government, and so if he criticised him and his job too much, well, then the government might fall and the Prime Minister would be out of a job. And once again, serving self above all else, the politicians decided, well, we can't really tell the truth, so we can only generally ask for clemency. And of course the King, being a political opponent of the government, is just like, well, why should I do you a favour? You're not doing me any favours. In fact, you've made my life a whole lot more difficult with various other issues, so off you go. And in that circumstance, no one had much of a choice other than to shoot Byng. Now, as unfair as his execution manifestly was, in the long term, much as I hate to say it, it probably did actually have a beneficial consequence for the Royal Navy. For one thing, it did mean people had to turn around and go, maybe we should revise the laws of court-martial just a little bit, which obviously helped everyone further down the line. But also, it kind of underscored a point, because, as I said, Byng had made an 8 out of 10 effort, which most people would have said, that's not too bad, and he'd still been shot for it. So it acted as a bit of a driving impetus to subsequent multiple generations of the Royal Navy of, unless you go like 10 out of 10 or 11 out of 10 full at the enemy in a way that no one can argue you could have done anything more, you'll just be shot when you get home. So you might as well go all out, at which point you got several generations of highly motivated Royal Navy officers essentially hurling themselves with absolute ferocity against anyone unfortunate enough to come under their guns. And by the time the rules of war and the court-martial guidelines had been revised so that it wasn't quite as severe a sentence as the type that Byng had gotten, well, now the absolutely furious rip and tear into the enemy at all costs had kind of just become enmeshed in Royal Navy tradition, and they were quite happy to, go full cornate on them anyway. Not a lot's really changed, because every time one or two officers try and be slightly more sane, everyone looks at them and go, why are you not doing the same as, well, that lot of lunatics over there who are trying to sail off of their sinking ship with a cutlass and stab a hole in the enemy? And on the rare occasion someone doesn't, it made it much easier to actually get rid of them. Think of a couple of examples of some of the early British sides of the engagement in some of the engagements in the War of 1812. It was very easy to go, look, you clearly didn't do your utmost. We could shoot you, but now, thanks to the revisions in laws, well, your social cachet is pretty much destroyed already, so we're going to let you off lightly by essentially suggesting that you get out of any idea of commanding at sea again, and ideally out of the Navy, and if you in any way, shape or form argue this, well, we still have the option to shoot you. Bruce Kiernan asks, what did the US know about Yamato and Musashi, and when did they know it? Did they know that they were being built at all? Well, of course, the Japanese were doing absolutely everything to make sure no one knew what the Yamatos were, but they had varying levels of success. However, their success was probably the most pronounced against the US, which might seem odd considering the US was the one most heavily involved in the fight against Japan. But there were two problems. Firstly, because the Japanese knew the Americans were their primary antagonists, they, as much as they put special effort into concealing the existence of the Yamatos at all, they put extra special effort into concealing the existence of the Yamatos from the Americans. To the point that in early 1938, there's congressional testimony where Admiral Leahy's being interviewed by congressional representatives, and the congressional representatives are saying, well, look, some of the European powers are saying Japan's building 46,000-ton battleships, this in an era where, in theory at least, the naval treaties are still in place. And they ask, well, what does the US Navy have to say about that? And Leahy just essentially says, look, we don't know. We can't confirm anything. Whatever the French or the British or whoever might have come up with, we just don't have that information at the moment. And then as time goes on into the early 40s, you have various estimates made, most hovering around 46,000 tons. There's some debate as to whether they have 9 guns or 12 guns, but everyone's thinking they've got 16-inch guns, so essentially either kind of a slower Iowa, perhaps with heavier armor, or perhaps a Montana-ish equivalent, or I guess a slightly smaller than Montana at that point, so perhaps slightly slower still. And by mid-war, there's actually even revisions. They're even saying in some elements of the US intel community that actually the Yamatos are just 35,000 tons armed with 9 16-inch guns, i.e. roughly equivalent to North Carolina or South Dakota, which seems slightly absurd on the face of it because, well, why would they break the naval treaty system to build a ship that's entirely incompliant with the naval treaty system, say perhaps the 14-inch clause, but they could have just argued against that. Now, by this point, you were talking about 42, 43. The British, and well, previously the French as well, but now the French are out of the war, but the British themselves and so forth, they actually have more of an accurate idea of how big and potentially how heavily armed the Yamatos are, because as Japanese prisoners are being taken, the occasional Japanese prisoner who's seen Yamato or Musashi for real is giving Allied intel a reasonable assessment of their true size and capabilities. But whereas the British are just kind of like, well, that seems worrying, maybe we should prepare for that kind of thing. The US is still, in some elements, very much subject to the incredibly racist view that they had of the Japanese pre-war, to the point that, to quote, and I'm quoting from a source directly at this point, in early 1943, in the White House, it said that when it suggested that perhaps these ships are larger than 45,000 tons and 16-inch guns, it said, this is just Nipponese rodent propaganda. Essentially, major elements of the US intelligence and political apparatus categorically refused to believe that the Japanese could possibly build anything bigger. Towards the end of the war, there's beginning to be acceptance in some fields that perhaps Yamato and Musashi really are much larger and more heavily armed, in part because you're beginning to get, direct photos of them from Subian Sea, where Musashi is sank, and then later on, obviously, Tengo, where Yamato is sunk, and previous submarine attacks on both of them. So it's becoming harder and harder to deny that these are some truly monstrous ships. But full acceptance within the US specifically, which is what the question was, as to the true size and capabilities of the Yamatos only really comes about post-war. It's becoming more accepted towards the end of the war that they might be bigger than 45,000 tons and 16-inch guns, but it's not until they actually discover some full-on confirmatory evidence in Japan that they basically have to acknowledge the truth. Gabriel A. Hawkins asks, much has been written about the putative similarities between the Maltas and the Midways. They came to similar conclusions concerning where and how to armour the flight decks, for example. Did the Maltas share the Midway's perplexing focus on surface threats, e.g. heavy belt armour and a battery with enhanced surface capabilities, and did the Japanese, as the remaining naval air power, have a design in the works that reached similar conclusions? Now, with the Japanese, obviously, their sort of G14, G15 program, as I've done a 5-minute guide on, it does, with the G14s especially, end up with a kind of Midway-sized carrier, but somewhat earlier in design than either Midway or Malta. But as far as the Japanese are concerned at that point, as you can also kind of see with the Shokaku's previous, they've very much given up on the idea that their carriers will ever be engaged in any kind of significant surface engagement. So they're not looking at heavy guns or particularly heavy armour. There is still armour, but it's designed more against things like nearby bomb blasts, perhaps small caliber guns like destroyers or light cruisers, but more generally blast, perhaps rockets if they've thought about it, but that kind of level of protection. And the Maltas are very much in the same boat. They do have, as designed, a 4-inch armour, but again, this is suitable to stop bomb blasts and protect the magazines from those in terms of near misses. Again, light caliber weaponry. It'll also quite handily stop any form of airborne cannon, whether that be 20mm or 40mm. I mean, you don't necessarily need 4-inch armor to stop a 40mm round, but it helps. As well as a variety of other threats, especially obviously for the British. They know all about rockets by that point. So most of the easily carryable rockets that you could mass fire, a 4-inch belt will stop. It's only the Midways that are going further, the much, much heavier belts and the surface optimized or at least surface influenced guns. The Japanese design and the Malta are basically going, these guns, technically they're dual purpose in case we end up with a destroyer or two too close for comfort, but realistically these are primarily heavy anti-aircraft guns above all else. It is somewhat weird to think about these days, especially with kind of the pop history effect, but the US carrier designs, both the Essex and the Midways, are actually a little bit behind the curve as far as protection against surface threats is concerned, as compared to the Japanese and the British. Both of those navies, although you do obviously have the British with armoured hangar carriers as well, they've both kind of moved on to the idea that it'll only be airborne weaponry, near burst bombs, and perhaps very small caliber naval gunfire that they might have to protect against. It's the US alone who's still dragging their feet and thinking about, some of the scenarios ahead in fleet problems where heavy cruisers get round to attack the carriers. And that drags on really a lot longer than it should do, which, as I say, is a little bit weird considering that in a lot of other areas, for obvious reasons through experience in World War II, the Americans are beginning to pull ahead in carrier design. Although, at the same time, it is the British who managed to invent and share with everybody the working steam catapult, the angled flight deck, and the reflector landing system. So, who knows? I personally suspect that, in part, it may have actually been the US's sheer industrial potential that was maybe keeping it a little bit behind the curve on some of these things, because although obviously the Essex is a good design generally, it does have its flaws, as does the Midway with this thick belt armour. And I think sometimes the US was maybe looking at it from a perspective of, well, we don't need to necessarily make every single advance because we can get a 9 out of 10 carrier and we can just build a ton of them, and that will actually be faster and easier. The whole thing of, it takes 95% of the effort to close the last 5%. And only 5% of the effort to get to 95%, or similar analogies. I suspect the Americans, to a certain degree, were going, well, look, this is 90 to 95% good enough, and now we're going to build a ton of them rather than spend the next 6 months fine-tuning the details to get 100%. Whereas the British, obviously the Japanese being a bit left behind through being bombed to pieces, but maybe the Royal Navy towards the end of World War II, with somewhat a more limited construction capabilities when it came to carriers and so forth and in terms of flight groups playing a bit of catch up, is maybe looking a bit more closely into the finer tricks and things that can advance carrier capacity. In much the same way as in the late 19th century, you would see the French, perhaps, for example, being early adopters and refiners successfully of significant uses of electrical power, like electrically driven turrets in their ships, despite the Royal Navy at that point being by far the bigger fleet, and to be fair, again, technologically advanced in some other areas, but the French, needing the advances and the advantages of those little changes, were more motivated to make them. Pedden Harley asks, in the aftermath of the Battle of Hampton Roads, John Dahlgren sent bronze shot for Monitor's guns, which seemed to have been 9-inch cast iron hollow shot with an inch-thick bronze jacket to bring them up to 11-inch caliber. These projectiles seem to have been intended for a subsequent encounter with CSS Virginia. Would you mind speculating upon what advantage Dahlgren may have thought these projectiles would give, as well as what you imagine further testing against armour would have shown? So, without reference to any particular tests that might have been done, Pedden Harley also supplied a couple of period messages which I think can begin to draw some inferences from. So on the 17th of March 1862, the chief engineer of USS Monitor writes the following. He says, the bronze shot, so it's the bronze encased shot, which Captain Dahlgren has sent us, I consider as superior for our purposes to the wrought iron. Their weight of 160 pounds is in their favour, so far as the gun is concerned, over even the cast iron shot, and from the experiments tried they will have superior penetration. Our difficulty, however, was not the want of penetration of the cast iron shot, as we now have proof, but their want of homogeneity, causing them to go almost anywhere except where the gun was aimed. The bronze cast over the hollow 9-inch shot must give a very well-balanced missile and remove the only difficulty we had. And then separately, William N. Jeffers, who at that point is the lieutenant commanding USS Monitor, writes actually the previous day, March 16th, 1862, initially about the cast iron shot that was fired at Virginia, and then he says he's inspected the bore of the guns with a mirror, can't find any trace of damage from firing the shot, and he says, unless absolutely necessary, I shall fire no more cast iron shot, as I am satisfied that shells are not more liable to fracture. The bronze-coated shot I shall reserve for a special occasion. The wrought iron shot I shall send on shore to remove the temptation to fire them. I am satisfied that he calls it the Merrimac, but the Virginia, cannot seriously injure the Monitor, but an explosion of a gun might destroy the turret. So in the second correspondence, they seem to be concerned about the possibility of cast iron shot perhaps damaging the interior of the Monitor's guns, potentially even jamming, and therefore causing the destruction of the gun and the destruction of the turret along with it. And he seems to think that using wrought iron shot partly will deal with this, but also that the bronze-coated shot would be useful for this as well, but that the bronze-coated shot should be reserved for a special occasion. Meanwhile, the chief engineer thinks that the bronze-coated shot will have superior penetration to cast iron shot, but also that the bronze-coated shot will improve accuracy. So what I think personally is going on here is that some part of Dahlgren's celebrations might have been around the fact that you've got cast iron shot, which presumably, like most shot of this period, is going to be slightly smaller than the bore of the gun. And he's therefore potentially worried about, with the amount of power that's being used and so forth, that these shot maybe bounce around slightly inside the gun, causing damage and potential jams. And on top of that, they don't seem to be, properly weighted, and they're therefore very inaccurate. Now, where would a bronze shot help with this? Well, bronze, much like the copper driving bands you'd find on later shells, is of course a relatively soft metal, and if it's cast around a iron shot, which appears to have been done, then although the Dahlgrens are not rifled, you essentially would get not a rifling band effect, but a very good seal, because if you have your bronze 11-inch shot in there, you fire the gun, well, as the blast of the propellant igniting pushes it along, that bronze is going to deform, and that's going to form a perfect plug in the gun, so stop gases escaping around the shot, and it's also therefore going to stop the shot bouncing around inside the gun. But because it is a relatively speaking soft and abradable material, it's not going to jam, it's just going to keep going down the gun, at which point you're going to get maximum propulsive force behind the shot, and a shot that's relatively speaking stable when it exits the gun, which would mean, one, it's likely to actually go in roughly the direction you want it to go. Two, as the chief engineer reports, it's a very well balanced thing, so that further improves its accuracy. And three, because up until the point it leaves the gun, it's going to have held back most or almost all of the propulsive force, it's therefore probably going to exit at a higher speed, which will obviously in and of itself give you better penetration. So I think that partly it's about the accuracy of the gun, of the shot, sorry, and not damaging the gun in providing that accuracy. But when it hits, it potentially again could cause some better penetration, because again it is being bronze. It may, when it impacts the iron of the armor of a target, begin to splay out considerably faster and with considerably more enthusiasm than iron would, which may well shatter, at which point it's in some ways almost acting like a soft armor piercing cap rather than the ultra hard ones you'd see in World War II era guns, and providing, if you like, a form of stick for the shell. So instead of bouncing away, it's kind of almost held onto the armor of the enemy ship. And then, obviously, as it gets moved aside, whether that be shattered or pushed, depending on the velocity and energies involved, it's kind of guiding the shot in, as well as pre-stressing the armor in question and perhaps beginning to deform it. And then this iron core, the shot in the middle, comes through and it hits pre-stressed armor. And then even if the iron shot begins to disintegrate, well, the bronze is kind of keeping it together as a kind of jacket. And combined with the higher speed that theoretically it would have exiting the muzzle, that overall could increase its armor penetration capabilities. Now, of course, that is all theoretical based on the material qualities and material properties of bronze versus iron and the guns and armor available at the time. And it would be very interesting to see if that is how it all holds up, because in theory, some of what I just mentioned actually is some of the basic physics behind certain kinds of bullets at much lower calibers in modern and, period firearms. But how exactly that would scale in an 11-inch Dahlgren versus a bunch of iron plating, it would be interesting to know. The interesting thing is that the chief engineer says from the experiments tried, past tense, not to be tried, they will have superior penetration. So potentially that indicates that somewhere out there may be some tests that Dahlgren's already done, which, to be fair, given Dahlgren's nature, he probably did do, because he's not going to just randomly send a bunch of shot out there on a whim. So potentially there's a really interesting little sideline of research there to find out what exact tests Dahlgren did with these bronze-coated shot, and how effective were they, and were there any notes on why or what the bronze looked like after it had hit the target. Lord Nelson asks, what was the role of Captain of the Fleet in the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, and why weren't they more common? The reason they're not particularly common is that Captain of the Fleet is not a rank, so it's not like you become Captain, then Captain of the Fleet, then Commodore, then Rear Admiral. Captain of the Fleet is a post or a position within a fleet, and only a fleet above a certain size, at least, well, depending on which copy of the regulations that you're reading. At one point it was traditional for a captain of the fleet to be appointed if the fleet was larger than 10 ships, but if you look at other versions, such as the Queen's Regulations for the Royal Navy of 1862, it simply says that whenever an admiral of the fleet shall hoist his flag, a captain of the fleet shall be appointed to assist him, and a captain of the fleet may also be appointed when a fleet or squadron under any other flag officer may be deemed by the Admiralty to be of sufficient extent and importance to require one. But the analogous position these days, and perhaps in some navies during the Second World War, would be the chief of staff of an admiral's staff. So someone via whom the admiral would express his will. So the admiral would say, yeah, I want to do this, this, and this is my plan. But it would be the chief of staff who would then take those instructions and turn them into battle orders in the World War I or World War II setting to be distributed throughout the fleet, or in a more immediate setting, perhaps in the age of sail, admiral's orders would be communicated to the captain of the fleet, who would then see them done. So he's essentially the right-hand man, in much the same way as on a regular ship, or in the Royal Navy terms, a private ship. You might have the captain and the first officer, or a commander and an officer on deck, via whom the captain may make his will expressed, but the minutiae of actually getting it done would fall to an immediately inferior ranking officer. So, as you can see from the Queen's Regulations in the middle of the 19th century, the idea is, well, an admiral of the fleet would always get a captain of the fleet, and if the Admiralty decides that, well, there's an admiral in command of this or that detachment, and we think he needs a bit of help to actually carry out his duties rather than doing them all himself, then a captain of the fleet will be appointed to that position as well. Now, that can be a bit confusing, because a captain of the fleet being a post, not a rank, means you could be a captain, a commodore, or a rear admiral and be the captain of the fleet, which means that technically aboard the flagship you might have two captains, the flag captain, who is the actual captain of the ship, and the captain of the fleet, who is more senior to him, but is not in charge of the day-to-day running of the ship, but is the sort of mouthpiece of the admiral. But as a result, that's why they're not particularly common, because essentially they only rock up when there are admirals around, and the admiral is in charge of a fairly large unit. And of course, given the way that squadron sizes could change a lot quite quickly, you could end up in a situation where an admiral perhaps is in charge of a 6, 8, 10 strong blockading force, and therefore does not have a captain of the fleet. But then, the enemy has combined and is preparing to sail. Quick, here, have some reinforcements from England, and we're also going to bring this other blockading squadron up. So now you have 30 ships of the line, but you may not have the time to appoint a captain of the fleet or a spare senior officer to appoint as captain of the fleet, just even though you've now got a fleet 3 times the size. Chris Balance asks, how efficient was the design of the Great Eastern's hull? Was a tank test ever carried out to estimate the performance of Great Eastern before it was built? Sadly, there was no tank testing of Great Eastern's hull for hull efficiency, mostly because Froude's tank testing to do exactly that postdates the construction of Great Eastern by about 2 decades. But in terms of overall efficiency, well, she has a length to beam ratio of a little bit over 8:1, so that's not actually half bad. But, she was built by Brunel, and contemporaries of the time said that her underwater hull profile was in keeping with the best standards of the time period. So, efficiency-wise, given her sheer scale and ultimately her performance, I think for the time period her hull was pretty good. Now, of course, the interesting thing would be to take hull measurements from, say, something like Brunel's previous work, the SS Great Britain, and take the plans of the SS Great Eastern and put a basic hull together and feed that through some kind of modern computer program that could give you the exact efficiency of the two hulls, and then perhaps compare them to a standard modern freighter. But unfortunately, that's about as far as I could tell you without reference to some extremely intensive study into her hull form versus the hull form of various other ships, noted for their hull efficiency at the time and thereafter. Fireteam Joker asks, I read that late in World War II, the Allies started to build makeshift runways on their LSTs. Did Japan seriously consider this as an alternative to building large fleet carriers? I imagine they would have worked well for kamikaze attacks. Well, no, Japan wasn't considering this kind of thing on a few grounds. Firstly, Japan didn't have anything like the number of LSTs, or LSTs generally, that the Allies had. So that was one problem. Secondly, as you can see here, the LSTs were not being used to launch conventional attack aircraft, fighters, and so forth. They were, in fact, being used to launch high-wing observation aircraft, essentially short takeoff and landing aircraft that were used as artillery spotters. And as you can probably also tell from the presence of the bridge superstructure immediately behind and the mast, you weren't going to land on these things. The idea was that the LST would still have its full load of troops and vehicles aboard, but as it approached the landing beaches, it could launch half a dozen of these little observation aircraft, then come in with its regular troops, unload them all, turn around, and potentially go back and pick up some more observers. The observer aircraft would then fly around, radioing in all the radio messages necessary to correct artillery fire, and then they would land ashore. There were 3 LSTs that were fitted with the Brody system, which is essentially a gigantic sling hook to try and catch some of the aircraft and return them back to the LST so you could run them continuously, but they were in the minority of an already fairly small group of carrier LSTs, if you like. One advantage of the whole situation, as I said, is that it doesn't actually affect the LST's ability to carry troops and vehicles in its hold, and also the structure to support and launch the aircraft is actually pretty lightweight and can be put on in less than a couple of days. The problem with Japan doing something similar, apart from the lack of any significant number of ships of this kind of size and capability, is, well, an LST is not a particularly fast vessel, and the runway is not particularly long, which means that, yes, you can launch a slow, high-wing monoplane observer aircraft, but anything fast enough to stand a chance of penetrating an Allied fleet's anti-aircraft screen, as well as carrying a useful payload, yeah, that ain't coming off a ship this size. Sebastian asks, I recently read the US captured 37 Japanese sailors after the Battle of Midway, some of whom were cooperative. One prisoner from Hiryu gave an extremely detailed account of the attack on Pearl Harbor, which a post-war study deemed to be almost entirely accurate. I would like to hear more about that and anything else they might have divulged during their interrogation. Well, relating everything that they talked about would be far too long, but the best thing I can suggest is drop me an email or a Discord message or even a Patreon message, and I can send you a whole series of links to the US Navy history website, because there they have transcripts of a whole load of the interrogation, so you'll be able to see everything in detail, everything from formations to when carriers were hit, what formations they were in, were there aircraft on deck, below deck, what were the Japanese aircraft doing, what was the Japanese perspective on the incoming attacks by American aircraft, what order, how they came in, how successful they thought they were. One of the guys from Kaga, who watched what he reckoned was a submarine torpedo bounce off the ship's side and fail to detonate, and all sorts of things like this. Obviously, being an interrogation, there's quite a long transcript involved. However, I do have to inject one word of caution, because you have essentially 2 sets of interrogation records. You have interrogation records from Japanese prisoners taken after the Battle of Midway, who are obviously recounting immediately what happened at Midway and some stuff before, and you have separate interrogations of Japanese officials and officers at the end of World War II, which include coverage of the Battle of Midway and Pearl Harbor, because they were some of the few who were there at one or both of those engagements. But of course, they're telling their stories 3-4 years down the line. So they have the archived records of both sets of interrogations, and they are very enlightening, but you do have to make sure to distinguish between the two. And as I said, they're incredibly lengthy. So yeah, definitely drop me a message and then you can read the whole thing. Todd Webb asks, With the Washington and London Treaty rules lawyering, would it have been possible for the Royal Navy to put a bunch of high-angle dual-purpose 8-inch County-class turrets in the Pacific under the grounds that, honestly, it's an anti-aircraft gun? Sadly, I don't think it's possible, because if you look at Article 19, which is the one to do with fortifications, it says the maintenance of the status quo under the foregoing provisions, after it's listed all the places you're not supposed to fortify, implies that no new fortifications or naval bases shall be established in the territories and possessions specified, that no measure shall be taken to increase the existing naval facilities for the repair and maintenance of naval forces, and no increase shall be made in the coast defences of the territories and possessions above specified. This restriction, however, does not preclude such repair and replacement of worn-out weapons and equipment as is customary in naval and military establishments in times of peace. So, classifying 8-inch twin turrets as anti-aircraft guns isn't going to get you anywhere under the basic principles of that article, because whether you're defending against aircraft or against ships, it is still an anti-aircraft gun. I suppose you could make some kind of rules lawyery argument for the 3,000-ton refit allowance allowed to older warships, that you could include an 8-inch gun in there as some kind of anti-aircraft gun, but that would take up all your weight and be a bit pointless anyway. The only way I could see you getting such a thing in would be under that last sentence, does not preclude such repair and replacement of worn-out weapons and equipment as is customary in naval and military establishments in times of peace, because there were some relatively hefty guns in some parts of the British Pacific holdings, even some 9.2-inch. And if you were replacing a 9.2-inch with a twin 8-inch, well, you're doubling the number of barrels, but ultimately you are actually slightly lessening the caliber. And then you could also, at that point, potentially make an argument, well, there's a 9.2-inch gun there. We could have replaced it with another 9.2-inch gun or similar, and some anti-aircraft guns to defend it. But, we're doing you a favour. We're just putting 2 guns in, which is a lot less than the 3 or 4 we might otherwise have had to put in as part of replacement, because they're dual purpose. And that way maybe get away with some twin 8-inch turrets, but I think that's probably about as far as you could push it. Sage of Irrelevance asks, I'm curious how German U-boats actually got from German ports to their operational areas in the North Atlantic. Please briefly walk us through the journey of the average German U-boat, say a Type 9, as it tries to go from northern Germany to the North Atlantic, say shortly before the fall of France. Did they spend most of the trip underwater? Did they travel mostly at night? Did they prefer clear skies or inclement weather when leaving port? So, generally speaking, submarines would much prefer inclement weather, because low cloud ceilings, rain, fog, anything like that makes it far, far, far more difficult for them to be spotted either on the surface by surface ships or by aircraft, obviously especially with low cloud cover, and rough waters, so driving rain and high waves, also makes it both difficult to operate ASDIC or sonar and to get any meaningful readings. So bad weather, definitely better as far as the U-boats are concerned. Now, typically, the U-boats would try and travel on the surface at speed by night and remain underwater by day, simply because, well, during the day, the risk of being discovered by aircraft was a bit too great. However, obviously, things could vary slightly. So, especially when you are further north, obviously, you've got a lot more hours of darkness. You can travel on the surface for longer. If you think you're clear of Allied aircraft, so particularly once the Germans have taken Denmark and Norway, you might be under Luftwaffe air cover. You might risk travelling on the surface and therefore faster for some of the daylight hours. But one of the easiest ways of determining the routings of the German subs is also just to look at where U-boats were sunk. And what this essentially shows is that both before and after the conquest of Norway, most German U-boats heading from Germany into the Atlantic would head up the eastern side of the North Sea, past the Danish coast, along the Norwegian coast, until well north of Britain, and then they'd cut west through the gap between the north coast of Scotland and the south coast of Iceland. Very, very few U-boats ever seem to have used the Greenland-Iceland gap, simply because, well, there wasn't a lot of shipping there to attack, and it would have involved going on a very, very long route, which would have severely cut into their on-station time. So instead, they went between Iceland and the UK, again favouring the area further away from the UK, closer to the Icelandic coast, which is one of the reasons, amongst others, that the Allies felt they had to take Iceland pretty early in the war, so they could put air patrols and such up there. And then from there, they would head out into the Atlantic and start their raiding. And the reason for that kind of route is fairly obvious. I mean, yes, in theory, by hugging the British coast, you could get there a lot faster and a lot sooner, but short-range patrol ships, drifters and trawlers, as well as far more numerous patrol aircraft would be present much closer to the British coast, whereas the further away you are, the more and more you're forcing the British to rely on long-range air patrols, because, well, you're not really going to be sending anti-submarine escorts off the coast of Norway, especially, well, one, you can't before Norway's taken, because the U-boats can travel in Norwegian territorial waters, covertly, obviously, and the Allies can't send escorts in there to attack them, because that'd be violating the laws of neutrality. And then once Norway's been conquered, well, as I said, there'll be Luftwaffe and coastal defences, so they can't go there anyway. So you're massively reducing the threat to the U-boats, basically down to just the longer range coastal command aircraft, until the U-boats are almost all the way into the Atlantic. And finally, for this week, Dennis Kocher asks, my question revolves mostly around Captain Gatch. How exactly did he get to be commander of the South Dakota, and why did he only engage Kirishima with the secondary battery? His command seems to be plagued with incidents, and I'm wondering what was his actual culpability in them. Gatch's path to command of South Dakota is fairly unremarkable. I mean, he had a decent enough Navy career and was senior enough when South Dakota was new and needed a captain to, well, be on the list to become captain. There wasn't anything particularly for or against giving him the captaincy, as far as I can see. In terms of the other incidents, he does seem to have had a bit of bad luck during his command of South Dakota, but I think most of it is not necessarily his fault. The collision with Mahan is, well, everyone's doing evasive action, and Mahan and South Dakota end up breaking towards each other. Well, okay, that's just as much on the destroyer as the battleship. And the going aground incident, well, uncharted reef that the South Dakota hits is by its very nature uncharted and therefore unknown. Therefore, I mean, okay, hitting it isn't great, but if nobody knows it's there, you can't reasonably be expected to avoid it. Having a chunk taken out of one of the 16-inch guns by a Japanese bomber, well, that's the enemy getting a vote on the action. Now, as far as engaging Kirishima with the secondary battery only, I don't think this is actually accurate. I've basically, as far as I can see, the only places this seems to be stated on the internet with any degree of vehemence is the Wikipedia article on Captain Gatch, which I would note does not have any citations for this claim. In fact, the whole bit about the incidents that occurred on South Dakota while he was in command is completely uncited. The last citation prior to that is a citation for his 2 Navy crosses. The next citation is the reason that he's invalided off to shore duty in 1943. The whole section about his supposed criticism of Gatch, completely unsourced, which isn't really a good marker. Now, during the battle, during the night action, South Dakota does use her 16-inch guns, her main battery, fairly often. However, you've got to bear in mind that at the time that she is engaged by Kirishima and friends, she's had a whole slew of power issues, including power issues that have temporarily disabled part of her main battery. And most recently, the ongoing power issues crippled her radar. So, obviously, at night, her radar is the thing that's guiding her main battery. And just after the radar has had power restored to it, although not necessarily before it's been brought fully online again, because obviously just because you've got power, you've got to start the thing up and get it all working. Then South Dakota is highlighted by the searchlights of multiple ships, and including Kirishima, and that is then heavily engaged. Now, at that point, it's rather understandable why the secondary battery is the only one to engage, because the 5-inch guns are obviously far faster to maneuver than the 16-inch turrets, and when a bunch of searchlights start shining on the ship, well, they can very rapidly swivel and return fire. The problem is that the searchlights highlight the ship right before a whole bunch of shells start landing. The other thing is, of course, the 5-inch guns are initially the appropriate type of gun to use, because you don't know what's mounting the searchlights out there. Thus far, they've run into small Japanese ships, so rapid-fire 5-inch guns are exactly the right thing to deal with small cruisers or destroyers that are poking searchlights at you, which would be in keeping with Japanese tactics to use small, more expendable ships to highlight with a target with searchlights, allowing the heavier ships to engage a target whilst themselves being unengaged. So that's all perfectly fine. And even if you want to bring the 16-inch battery online, well, as I said, you've got all these power issues. You're not certain if it's going to work properly. You're still trying to get the radar to work properly. And then you have to start rotating the turrets while coming up with a fire control solution for the 16-inch guns. And by the time anyone's able to do that, well, now South Dakota is on fire everywhere. And guess what? The data connection to her radar's not working. And the poor people in the main battery who are looking out of their rangefinders, the backup to the backup to the backup to the backup to try and open up, well, all they can see is the glare of the fires on the decks around them. So there is precious little point engaging with the 16-inch battery because they can't see anything. So what they're going to do, blind fire off into the night? Well, that's not going to do anybody any good. At which point, yeah, the fact that only the secondary battery engages makes perfect sense. And on top of that, of course, it's not even Kirishima necessarily that they engage. They're engaging the ships pointing the searchlights at them. Washington is the one who absolutely hammers Kirishima for the most part. And honestly, it's quite difficult to say that they should have done anything else, considering at that point, well, your radar's out of action, your power systems are on the fritz, and shortly thereafter, whole chunks of your superstructure are being blown apart. And that brings us to the end of this week's Drydock. Thank you very much for listening. Hope to see you again in another video soon.